Larry Luke is a brilliant, meticulous, and cold forensic expert whose mind operates like a precise machine, capable of unraveling the deepest secrets of a crime scene with unsettling ease. Despite his exceptional skills as a criminal profiler, abilities that could have secured him a place in the FBI, Larry made an inexplicable choice to join the Miami Metropolitan Police Department instead. His colleagues see him as a prodigy, someone whose deductive skills verge on the inhuman. But behind his impeccable professionalism lies a dangerous obsession, learning from the killers who always leave something behind. Larry does not seek justice. He feels no horror at the crimes he analyzes, nor indignation toward the murderers he pursues. On the contrary, he studies them with a disturbing fascination. Every case is a lesson, every mistake a clue to perfecting his own method. Because he doesn't just analyze them, he begins to identify with them. However, something inside him holds him back. A trace of humanity clings to the remnants of a life he once had, to a family that someone he is searching for took away from him. Larry despises the world around him, a world where criminals don't just destroy each other but drag the innocent down into their spiral of perversion and death. Why can't he do the same? Why can't he kill? If we're all going to die anyway, who would care if I dedicated my perfection to the art of murder? As those around him fail to notice the signs, Larry follows an increasingly dark path. The line between justice and crime blurs, and the question is no longer if he will fall into darkness, but when. I can be a god if I choose to. And when that day comes, there will be no footprints. No traces. No Larry Luke. Only the perfect killer will remain. Hello, everyone. Omni-sensei here with What If Dexter Had a Rival? Part 1. If you enjoy this content, please smash the like button. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Part 1 Chapter 1 to 15 starring Larry Luke. Occupation: Homicide Division Forensic Scientist, Criminal Profiler, Psychologist, Behavioral Investigator, Victim Analysis Specialist, Organized Crime, and Serial Crime Consultant. Appearance: Larry Luke is a young man under 30, with an athletic build and a penetrating gaze that reflects a deep understanding of the human mind. His serious, analytical face bears the marks of endless nights of work, but his presence remains intimidating and professional. His dark, slightly disheveled hair and sober, functional clothing are part of the image he projects as an expert in the criminal field. Series in this fanfiction: Maine, Dexter Secondary, Hannibal Secondary 2, Bad Boys. It was late at night. The heavy raindrops pounded against the window of a car parked outside a fast food restaurant, producing a rhythmic sound that was oddly pleasant to this particular man. On the deserted streets nearby, no cars or people could be seen, except for the restaurant's small staff. No matter how much one strained their eyes to see into the distance, there was nothing but solitude. Of course, who would be out on the streets at this hour on Christmas night? The sky was so hazy that it seemed to mirror a day steeped in melancholy, a gloomy, somber atmosphere. The rain made being outside even more unbearable, but at that moment, from the parking lot of a fast food restaurant, a man sat in his car, listening to the radio in silence while enjoying his dinner. As with every Christmas, he couldn't be at home. Of course, he wasn't just some ordinary person waiting for attention either. For anyone who had never been alone in a place late at night, this would be the perfect moment to fear that a serial killer might emerge to hunt for victims. Ordinary people often watch too many movies and connect those events to real life. To some, this might sound ironic, but others live in places where the night is an open invitation for someone to kill you and get away with it. As a result, some people grew fearful and sought out the most visible corners of the city to have a clear view of their surroundings while minimizing exposure to danger. But this man, named Larry Luke, was hoping for something interesting to happen that night. It's 12:45 a.m., and we continue with our special Christmas broadcast. We hope everyone has had a night full of joy and special moments with their loved ones. However, the celebrations have also brought some incidents across the country. That's right, Tom. At this hour, emergency services are still responding to traffic accidents in several cities. In Miami, a multi-car crash on Highway 405 has left at least 4 people injured, according to authorities. A combination of alcohol and rain-slicked roads appears to have been a key factor. Those aren't the real numbers. Larry Luke lazily leaned back against the driver's seat, his bangs covering a third of his face. His tired expression was filled with indifference as he listened to the radio and ate a hamburger. He glanced at the car window, where his reflection revealed an 8-pointed star tattoo on his neck. Anyone looking at him might suspect there was something off about him, but those who knew him would discover much more. The neon lights in the surroundings gradually faded, and fewer cars sped along the wet roads. Larry let out a long sigh, closing his eyes in an attempt to rest. His hands ran over his exhausted face, revealing diamond tattoos on his fingers. Of course, Larry could be anything but a man of low manners. Who was he fooling? He liked tattoos, they suited his personality, but that didn't mean he was some easily recognizable criminal. The end-of-year holidays always reminded Larry of the dark days of his childhood, forcing him to take refuge in his work in Miami. The pay was good, he had excellent recommendations, and he was here because the workload was enough to keep him busy. Besides, in this city, he wasn't underestimated for his young age. Beep. 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 Larry opened his eyes and glanced at the phone beside him, pulling it from his heavy, dark thoughts. Damn, just when I was celebrating with my big family. He let out a long sigh, grabbed the phone in the darkness, and held it up to his bored expression. The screen read 0:50 a.m. November 29, 2006, with the words, Command Center, flashing repeatedly. All the discomfort and unease he had felt moments before disappeared instantly at the sight of those words, and he quickly pressed the button to answer the call. Hello. Forensic Specialist Luke, sorry to bother you at this hour. A few moments ago, the primary forensic team on duty was dispatched southeast to investigate a major traffic accident. However, we've just received a report of a homicide that requires your presence. Luke sat up straight, switched his phone to speaker mode, and interrupted the woman as he started his car. Any details on the case? A male body was found in the bathtub of Ocean View Towers, Bayshore Avenue 1425, apartment 907. Sergeant Dokes is on the scene and urgently requesting a forensic specialist. Although a team has been sent, the sergeant specifically asked for you at the crime scene. All right, I'll be there immediately. Larry had already started his black Camaro, grabbed a bottle of pills from the glove compartment, and called his assistant. After ending the call, he drove toward the building. As soon as he entered the residential area and approached 1425 Bayshore Avenue, he saw the flashing police lights. Larry stepped out of his car and walked over, carrying a black case. A police officer spotted the investigation kit in Larry's hand, checked his ID, and greeted him. Hello, Forensic Specialist Luke, we've been expecting you. The crime scene is in apartment 907. Larry nodded, said, thanks, and entered the apartment building without another word. Since becoming a forensic pathologist, Larry rarely shook hands with people around him. Over time, it had become a habit. But this wasn't something that affected his job, nor did he care about it. After all, even police officers found it unsettling to touch someone who spent their days handling and analyzing corpses. When it came to dating, unless the women he met were prostitutes, finding a girlfriend was complicated. But right now, Larry's life was so chaotic that small concerns like that didn't bother him much. It's a good night. Perhaps the sedative he had taken before arriving had kicked in, calming his overly excited nerves about the new case. The itching sensation in his left eye, which had been twitching constantly, gradually subsided, and he breathed in relief. Taking sedatives wasn't something that troubled Larry. What truly worried him was that his enthusiasm for his work might disturb those around him. Most of the time, while working as a forensic specialist, Larry had to maintain a composed appearance. Like now, he had to fake seriousness, even though examining a crime scene thrilled him. There were so many details to observe that simply discovering clues about criminals excited Larry. How stupid must criminals be to get caught before the detectives even start their investigation? Good evening. There was a group of people waiting to see the spectacle ahead, so he couldn't afford to show any flaws in front of strangers. The elevator chimed as it reached the 22nd floor, and Larry stepped out, carrying his black case. From what he could observe so far, This community had an excellent geographical location. The building had been constructed 10 years ago, which explained why the elevator wasn't at the main entrance. As soon as he stepped off, Larry saw that the police had already set up the yellow caution tape around the area. At that moment, a familiar yet annoying silhouette appeared in front of him. Sergeant Dokes. Dokes was an African-American man who always kept his head shaved but maintained a mustache. He was about 5 feet 8 inches, 1.72 meters tall, with a defined, muscular build. His attire usually consisted of business casual clothing, dress pants and polo shirts tucked into his trousers. When the occasion required, he wore a full suit or an elegant jacket for formal events. From what Larry had observed, Dokes often wore shoulder holsters over his shirts. Occasionally, he wore a black sleeveless shirt with a red open button-up shirt over it. Most of his dress pants were dark-colored, ranging from gray to solid black. At times, he also wore khaki pants. What bothered Larry was that Sergeant Dokes' keen instinct could identify problems and see the dark side of people. Of course, to be a forensic expert and analyze crimes correctly, one had to be even worse than the killers. His colleagues understood that. As for everyone else, Larry didn't think much about it. "Luke, it's about time you got here." Larry glanced at the phone in his hand. The time read 1:25, and he asked, "Don't you sleep, Sergeant? Do you think the city sleeps from the heinous crimes that idiots like the ones I catch daily commit? I suppose not. Hurry up. Is it a difficult case?" Larry looked at the ground, thinking carefully about what he would encounter. Complex cases were his specialty. He was good at finding things others had missed and could recreate a murder scene using only his imagination. The command center called me first when this body was reported, so I arrived before the other detectives due to the highway accident. However, when I got here, the place seemed to have been thoroughly cleaned, and the floor was covered in water. Additionally, the exterior of the site where the body is located was completely ruined by dogs, so there were no footprints to collect. We didn't find anything in the bathroom at first glance. On the door handle, there was only a single blood stain, as if it had been wiped with a latex glove, which could help determine the cause. Blood. Then we should call Dexter. As he spoke, a middle-aged police officer, short but strong, emerged, leading a forensic team. "I don't think that's relevant," Dokes said while holding a golden retriever. Observing the dog's apathetic appearance, one could tell it must have been hungry for quite some time. "I'll decide that when I enter the crime scene." Dokes observed Larry's actions, his sharp eyes fixed on the young forensic expert who seemed to reconstruct the entire crime scene, starting from the surroundings. He had no issue with the methods Larry used. After all, thanks to his great talent, he had secured an important position in the police department. Larry's recommendations granted him more involvement in analyses. His mind, which could enter the world of killers, was highly valued, and many considered it a shame that he became a forensic expert instead of a special detective. But there was one thing that bothered Sergeant Dokes: the indifference Larry showed toward the people around him, as if only the result of the investigation mattered. Now, Dokes not only had to deal with the odd Dexter, but also with a forensic scientist who seemed to enjoy his work in a way that went beyond professionalism. Maybe Dokes could sense how Larry analyzed the crime scene and gathered information on how criminals were typically caught to create a perfect profile of a crime lord. Larry, of course, didn't care. The only reason he became a forensic expert instead of an FBI agent was that he had realized most forensic scientists didn't do their job well. Their mistakes had allowed some of the most famous serial killers on the internet to remain uncaptured. That was why he chose this profession, to show people that the perfect killer didn't exist. The Zodiac Killer. He could swear that if he had analyzed his crimes earlier, he would have caught him. It was a shame that now he was one step closer to his death. Weaknesses were common in people, inherent to their nature and consistent with their behavior. "Larry Luke, are you still at the crime scene?" Dokes asked, nearly losing his patience as he noticed Larry hadn't moved for the past 2 minutes. "Sergeant, now tell me the specific details." Dokes nodded and handed the leash in his hand to a police officer. At 00:20 in the morning, a resident of this very building, but one floor below, called the police. They said there was a dog barking upstairs, preventing them from sleeping, so they didn't knock on the door to check what was happening. An on-duty police officer was sent to take a look. Upon arriving at the scene, he found that the dog continued barking. Since no one responded, and there were doubts about whether the apartment was empty due to the lights being on, he kept knocking on the door. After knocking for a long time without getting a response, he contacted the building's security department. The security officer provided a phone number, saying it belonged to the apartment's owner. The officer called and realized the phone was ringing inside the room. The dog barked even louder when it heard the ringtone. The officer sensed something was wrong and called a locksmith. When they opened the apartment door, they found that the entire floor was covered in water. A golden retriever was standing on the living room sofa, barking wildly, occasionally directing its attention toward the bathroom. The officer walked down the hallway on the west side of the living room and found the bathroom door wide open. He discovered a man lying face up in the bathtub, completely submerged in water. The bathtub water was still overflowing. Even though the flow was very small, it had already flooded the hallway floor. They then notified the command center, and our branch took over the case. Unfortunately, nothing was found at the scene. Larry, who had listened to all the details, understood the nature of this crime, or maybe not. While absorbing the information, he had already put on protective clothing. Seeing that the water had reached past his toes in the room, Larry put on shoe covers and walked on the inspection mat to avoid getting his shoes wet. It seemed that the dog knew its owner was in trouble and kept barking for help. How did they know it was a murder? The answer was simple: everything was excessively clean. The fact that the killer managed to clean the scene indicated that they were methodical, had a clear plan, and were extremely meticulous. But why didn't they get rid of the dog? And how did the dog allow the killer to leave without attacking them? Larry entered the room carrying a suitcase. He had barely taken 2 steps when the elevator dinged at the door. A young man with rimless glasses came running out. Just as a police officer was about to stop him, Dokes gestured with his hand. "He's one of us." "That's Max, a student learning from forensic expert Luke," Dokes said as he looked at the young student. Max greeted everyone with a friendly smile. "Hurry inside." Max hunched his shoulders, quickly put on shoe covers and protective clothing, grabbed an SLR camera, entered the inspection area, and caught up with Luke. But before he could get closer, Larry raised his hand. "Be careful. Otherwise, the water on the floor will ripple. This is stagnant water, I don't want to get dirty." Max was so startled that he nearly dropped the SLR camera in his hand. "All right, I'll only move where you tell me to." Larry entered the bathroom. The door was open, but there were faint traces of blood on the handle, barely visible. Surveying the surroundings for a brief moment, he placed the heavy forensic kit he had been carrying on the sink. Larry then approached the bathtub and saw a deceased male completely submerged in it. At that moment, the faucet was turned off, but the bathtub continued overflowing. In reality, a scene like this no longer warranted much investigation. The man was submerged in the water very peacefully, with a slight smile on his lips. The deceased was shirtless, wearing black silk pajama bottoms. His arms were stretched out, with some fingertips slightly above the water. Except for a small wound on his chest, the body had no other notable marks. In Larry's mind, numerous possibilities, from the most far-fetched to the most probable, were aligned one by one in numerical sequence. What objects are missing or out of place? Did the victim have any planned appointments or meetings? Does the murder exhibit any known pattern or modus operandi? This was the question that fascinated Larry the most. If he could come across a killer with a profile in the FBI database, then he would be practicing against one of the best predators. It was a shame that there weren't many fish to catch here, which is why this place was perfect for Larry to analyze and refine his skills. Any specific motive? Maybe, just maybe, when he finally kills the predator that took his family, he will find the piece he has been searching for. Max, standing beside him, remained silent. Dokes tilted his head from outside the bathroom, touched Max's lower back, and gestured toward Larry with his chin. "Don't bother Larry, let him do his job. Observe carefully and take photos according to the required specifications." Dokes knew that Larry was a good forensic expert, but his analyses, when expressed, were always perfect. The high-ranking officials who brought Larry in had recommended him, and Dokes had set aside his pride when he realized that every single one of Larry's observations was flawlessly analyzed. He was never wrong. This is curious, Larry thought while examining the crime scene. From what he could tell, the houses in this community were of high quality. The person who lived here was definitely well off. There was a lot of water soaking the room and the bathroom for days, yet the people downstairs didn't notice anything because there were no leaks. Few buildings had such good construction quality, at least, that's what Larry had noticed living here in Miami. In the first apartment he had rented, if you spilled a glass of water, the neighbor downstairs would rush up immediately to check for a leak. Have you taken a sample of the bathtub water? Larry looked at Max, who, besides taking photos, was also following the investigation process he had learned from him. Yes, extracted. Additionally, only 7 or 8 blood droplets, each smaller than 0.3 centimeters, were found on the bathroom wall. Judging by the angle, they must have splattered from the direction of the bathtub. Dokes, standing to the side, aimed a laser at some dark red blood droplets on the tiles on the western side of the bathtub. Indeed, it was difficult to distinguish them from the black tiles. But the blood was there, so Dexter should be called in. However, Dokes wouldn't summon Dexter until Larry had finished. Have you checked the other rooms? Dokes nodded, slightly furrowing his brow. I checked. The door lock was intact, and there were no signs of tampering in the room. Are you questioning my work, Mr. Luke? Larry didn't respond to that question. Instead, he had heard that there were no less than $50,000 in cash in the nightstand drawer of the master bedroom, which ruled out robbery as a motive. However, the killer had strong anti-detection skills and had completely cleaned the entire room, leaving no valuable information behind. Maybe the money was a red herring, Larry thought the moment he heard about the cash. While analyzing the scene, Larry pointed to a white, ring-shaped mark on the dead man's right ring finger. You weren't the first one to arrive at the crime scene. You're more of an analyst to me, but you'll still be the lead forensic expert, Dokes said. He had called Larry precisely because he knew this crime needed a sharp eye and a twisted mind. Larry then understood that this was the mark of a ring. According to the sergeant, it had been removed after the victim's death, leaving an indentation from prolonged wear. The stab wound in the chest needs to be photographed and recreated in an advanced lab. There's too much water here, so any traces we find are useless. Let's find someone to transport the body to the lab as soon as possible. Max quickly took the photographs and carefully left the room with the inspection panel. After reporting Larry's findings to Sergeant Dokes, the sergeant immediately made the necessary arrangements. Max walked over to Larry and helped him carry the investigation case out of the bathroom. The two stood in the middle of the hallway, looking at the scene around them. Larry walked into the master bedroom. The decoration of the house was simple yet grand. It was clear that the owner was a successful person with good taste. Judging by the evidence found, the room had been meticulously cleaned and was absolutely spotless. Larry approached the nightstand and crouched down. A reflective, semicircular mark on the table caught his attention. It looks like a cup was placed here. Dokes narrowed his eyes and smirked. This has been removed, and I feel like there's some substance in this mark. Look, it seems like a kind of white powder that dissolves in water and settles after the water evaporates. Drugs. Maybe. Quiet, Larry ordered, closing his eyes and listening to every vibration of sound around him. A faint buzzing sound could be heard. Following the direction of the noise, Larry lifted the pillow from the headboard. Nothing was found. Except that the buzzing grew slightly louder. Larry lowered his head almost to the floor and then saw a charger plugged into a power outlet hidden beneath the headboard. Tracing the wires, he suddenly spotted a Sony Ericsson Walkman W810i. This type of phone was anything but common, especially since it was ideal for listening to audio. Dokes was startled and approached with a pleased expression on his face. It seemed like he hadn't done his job thoroughly enough, but it wasn't his fault. He hadn't had much time. Larry, of course, said nothing. That's why he was here. And that's why he had been called. He had realized from the start that it wasn't due to a lack of personnel. The previous forensic experts had cleaned up the details, but their reports had left Dokes in a dark abyss. Now, he hoped Larry could pull him out of that darkness. In a short time, Larry quickly used the evidence bag and prepared to pack the phone and charger. It was the first time he had seen a battery being charged in such a secretive place. At that moment, the phone stopped vibrating and displayed more than 20 missed calls. After checking it, Larry quickly collected the fingerprints. He had his own experience in memorizing fingerprints. But from the beginning, he knew this would lead them to a dead end. "I'll hand them over to the analysts." "You can do that, but no one other than the deceased has touched that phone." "I recommend giving it to the technicians instead to trace the sources of the calls," Larry said, trying to save the detective from unnecessary searches. "You do your job, I'll do mine." Of course, Dokes wouldn't let Larry interfere with his way of doing things unless he had solid grounds for his advice. That was the limit he could tolerate. Larry, of course, said nothing. He was a man of few words. There was no need to tell him he was good or that he had been chosen for certain cases. He knew he was irreplaceable. Aside from explanations during autopsies and scene reconstructions during case analyses, his voice was rarely heard at other times. After spending half a month at the center, Dokes had already understood his character. He smiled, placed the phone in the evidence bag, and sealed it. Has the deceased been identified? Dokes handed Larry a high-quality photo frame. The picture was of the deceased himself, sitting at his desk, looking like a successful man. LaGuardia just verified that the deceased is the homeowner, Derek Shepard. He is 35 years old and single. He is the deputy general director of an investment company. He is considered a young and successful man. Have you contacted his family? It is said that the deceased's parents settled abroad and that he was the only child in the family. He has quite a few lovers, but LaGuardia is still unsure which one to call. Dokes didn't know what else to say about this information. What else would a young man with a settled life do but live it passionately? The two walked toward the study while talking. Dokes picked up a handheld ultraviolet fluorescent lamp and showed it to Larry. Look, all the cabinets and tables have been carefully wiped clean. There's no trace of anything, even the light switches are covered with knit fabric to open and close them. Larry nodded, and the two left the room. Max had brought auxiliary police officers, and Larry helped them place the body into the cadaver bag. This action caused a lot of water from the bathtub to spill out. Shit. Larry looked at the corpse and noticed that rigor mortis had reached its most rigid and highly unusual stage in these cases, causing the deceased's arms to lift unnaturally. What had just happened is known as the post-mortem process, where the body's muscles stiffen due to chemical changes after death. Normally, rigor mortis begins to manifest about 2 to 6 hours after death, reaching its maximum rigidity between 12 and 24 hours, and then gradually disappearing within 36 to 48 hours. But here, it hadn't disappeared because the body remained in an unusual position before rigor mortis set in, so the muscles may have stiffened in that posture. He couldn't rule out other factors, such as cadaveric spasm, a rare phenomenon where the muscles contract abruptly at the moment of death, instantly locking the body into a fixed posture. Although that wasn't the case, neither was the accumulation of gases inside the body, which can cause involuntary limb movements, though this isn't the same as rigor mortis. Let's get this over with. With no other choice, Larry and Max broke the rigor mortis at the elbow joints before barely managing to close the body bag. As Larry turned around, he suddenly saw 2 long hairs in the remaining water at the bottom of the bathtub. He quickly picked them up with tweezers and placed them in the evidence bag. Dokes, it seemed, wanted to shine on his own, proving why he was a sergeant and boosting his contributions within the Miami Metropolitan Police Department. Larry tossed the evidence bag to Max and said, "Let's go back and do the autopsy. We mustn't waste time." Although Max was a little scared, he was also quite excited. It should be noted that Max had been following Larry for the past half-month, and everything had been peaceful and smooth. Today was the first time he encountered a homicide case. On the way, he noticed that Dokes was on a call. He didn't disturb him and quickly followed Larry back. The expression on Larry's lips relaxed slightly. Max's behavior at that moment was exactly what a forensic doctor should have. On the way, he called someone who was practically his superior. "Masuka, I heard you had a busy night." Nothing to get excited about, just a bunch of drunk idiots trying to recreate scenes from racing movies. "By the way, what do you have on your end?" "I need to send a sample to the pathology department for analysis." Sergeant Dokes is in a hurry since this is the first Christmas homicide in years within his jurisdiction. Max helped hold the elevator door open with his hand, and Larry stepped in while continuing the call. The Miami Metropolitan Police Department is located at 400 Northwest 2nd Avenue, Miami, near the city center in Florida. On both sides, there are 4-meter-high walls with barbed wire hanging from them. In front of the main entrance, at the end of the concrete pathway, there is a 4-story building with a whitish tile exterior. From left to right, on the first floor, there is the autopsy procedure acceptance room, for autopsy rooms, a locker room, a freezer room, a dressing room, a restroom, and a bathroom at the far right, with stairs leading to the upper floor. On the second floor, there is the surveillance room, the trace detection and analysis laboratory, and 6 offices. The third floor houses the forensic pathology laboratory and the DNA testing center, while the 4th floor contains the conference room and the center director's office. Larry and the other 2 quickly walked toward the center. "I heard you were studying to be an FBI agent. Tell me, Larry, what stopped you?" Max had always wanted to ask that question, and now he thought it was the perfect time. "The details." Larry entered the elevator. Max followed closely, suppressing his smile, and completed the necessary paperwork in the service room before following him to the locker room. Of course, details were the most important aspect that detectives worked with. If those details were wrong, the entire investigation would stall. That's why Larry paid attention to details and pursued them thoroughly to provide detectives with incredible tools. In no time, Larry had already changed into isolation clothing, raised his gloved hands, and looked at Sergeant Dokes, who had just appeared in the hallway. "Max, follow me." "Understood. You can come too, if you can handle what you're about to see." Dokes smiled. Who did Larry think he was talking to? Miami Metropolitan Police Department on a silent night, any sound was greatly amplified, making the central courtyard even more unsettling. The flash of car lights and the sound of brakes echoed through the courtyard. After a while, several staff members pushed a platform cart, transporting the deceased's body to the autopsy room. As the body bag was unzipped, the deceased's arms came into view. "Damn it." Sergeant Dokes had volunteered to record the autopsy, but as soon as he saw this small detail, he flinched. Holding the camera with one hand, he used the other to cover his mouth with a handkerchief. "Damn it, why is his hand still raised?" Larry said nothing. He and Max worked together to remove the body bag and take off the deceased's pajamas. Because of Miami's hot weather and the fact that the body had been submerged in the bathtub, the abdomen had turned a slightly greenish-yellow hue. Fortunately, the water in the bathtub wasn't hot. Otherwise, determining the time of death would have been much more difficult. The deceased was wearing only black silk pajamas, with no underwear or socks. Dressed like this, it meant he was either preparing to rest or was already resting. This suggested that only someone very close to him could have entered the room, especially considering that his pet did not attack the killer and allowed them to leave without any signs of struggle. Larry checked the time. The clock hands pointed exactly to 4:15. The autopsy would soon be completed, and the body could be sent for a primary pathological analysis to determine the next course of action. Larry carefully examined the body and confirmed one thing: when rigor mortis reached its peak, livor mortis had fully settled on the back and buttocks, which proves that the body remained in the same position after death. Dokes, unlike other detectives, had been in real battles as a former soldier, so he asked, "How long has he been dead?" The estimated time of death is around 24 hours. Apart from the stab wound to the chest, there were no external injuries on the body. It is suspected that the chest wound was the only fatal injury. As he spoke, Larry inserted a blunt, round probe into the stab wound. Within moments, he traced the path of the blade and measured the depth after withdrawing the probe. It turned out the wound was as deep as 10 centimeters. Larry looked at Max and asked, "What do these findings tell us?" "From what we can see," without a moment of hesitation, the knife went straight through the heart, between the third and fourth ribs. This quickly caused pericardial tamponade, leading to death in a single strike. Max was more than prepared to answer the question. However, the deceased did not resist at all, which is rather puzzling. Larry picked up a scalpel and used a straight-line incision method to cut from the deceased's lower jaw down to his abdomen. The deceased was someone who took great care of his physique. His fat layer was extremely thin, and his thoracic wall was not thick either. After removing the internal organs, Larry also extracted the victim's heart and placed it on a nearby tray. Dokes crouched down and took a photo. As he examined it, Larry pointed out the part of the heart that had been stabbed. The murder weapon used to stab the victim was likely a single-edged knife, 1.8 centimeters wide and between 8 and 10 centimeters long. Judging by the incision, the blade was extremely thin, no more than 0.1 centimeters thick. The two men standing in front of Larry fell silent, unable to imagine what kind of knife could match that description. Larry explained to Sergeant Dokes and Max, the entire heart is enclosed in a tough protective membrane called the pericardium. In this case, the knife pierced directly through both the left and right atria. The wound penetrated the atrium, causing significant bleeding. However, the blood didn't spray outward. Instead, it accumulated within the pericardium, leading to cardiac tamponade. As a result, the deceased died because the pressure from the trapped blood prevented the heart from beating properly. When a knife pierces an artery, the high pressure inside it causes rapid blood loss, leading quickly to shock and death. Dokes couldn't deny one thing: Larry's brilliance. In no time, he had uncovered numerous crucial details before the official report even reached them. It wasn't exactly standard procedure, but this was the fastest way to resolve a scandal that could ruin Florida's public image. Looks like this guy died tragically. Larry lifted his head and looked at Max, who had just spoken. Then he asked, "How do you know he died tragically?" "I can only imagine what I'd feel if I were in his place." Max simply didn't understand. He didn't realize that when someone gets stabbed, there isn't necessarily an agonizing pain. Did he not call for help, fight back, or resist? Dokes wanted to know if there were any signs of struggle. Larry gave a rare smile. "Good question. Masuka came to extract blood from the heart for analysis. I suspect this person was under the influence of drugs when he was killed. That's why he had no ability to resist and cooperated fully with the killer." Larry looked Dokes in the eye and added, "Otherwise, given his height of 186 centimeters and a weight of nearly 80 kilograms, it wouldn't have been possible for an ordinary woman to kill him." Dokes' eyes widened in shock, and his voice instantly rose by several octaves. "A woman? You know the killer is a woman?" Larry shook his head. "I doubt it. But when I pulled the deceased out of the bathtub, I found 2 long hairs in the water, and I recovered them. We'll send them for analysis later. The owner of the hair could be his romantic partner, the killer, or the person the killer wants us to suspect. However, seeing 2 hairs like these in a room that had been so thoroughly cleaned gave Larry a bad feeling." Larry continued the dissection, cutting through the trachea and lungs. The absence of fluid in the airways ruled out drowning as the cause of death. Upon examining the hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage, he found no signs of fractures or damage, confirming his initial hypothesis. He then opened the esophagus and stomach, where both the cardia and pylorus were in a normal state, with no traces of fluid associated with drowning. The chyme in the stomach contained remnants of relatively fresh green vegetables and particles of a reddish-orange hue. Larry carefully picked up each fragment, placed them under the magnifying glass, and brought his right eye closer to examine them attentively. The dinner included broccoli, shrimp, and carrots. "We'll collect these liquid residues, and if my assumption is correct, this is red wine. Then, we'll conduct a toxicology test. I'll take care of that." Dokes knew where to start, what to do once people began their new day, and where to find some clues about the killer. "My details are precise. Use them." Larry noted in a personal document the tools Dokes would use for the investigation and how he would track down the murderer. The deceased's last meal must have been a seafood-based menu at a high-end hotel. Judging by the degree of digestion of the stomach contents, the deceased died an hour after eating, meaning he died right after dinner. That romantic dinner became the last meal of Derek Shepard's life. Since he didn't defend himself, the assumption that the victim knew the killer gained strength. In that case, now that we know about a possible woman and a romantic date, I advise investigating all of the deceased's lovers as soon as possible. Don't tell me. Dokes was about to say the same words as before, but upon seeing that Larry's advice had solid foundations, he left the room, not before handing the camera to Max. Write a detailed report. We'll hold a meeting first thing in the morning. Once he left, Larry proceeded with the next steps, shaving the victim's hair, opening the skull, and finding no abnormalities in the brain tissue. He also dissected the back and found no abnormal subcutaneous injuries, except for liver mortis fluid. Finally, the wounds on the deceased's body were carefully and firmly sutured. Larry always sought to preserve the last dignity of the victims by leaving their bodies intact. After finishing and sending samples to the upper floor for analysis, both went to their respective showers to clean up. It was June, and the weather was starting to warm up. Even though it was early in the morning, they were completely drenched after wearing non-breathable isolation suits for several hours. After that shower, Larry changed into lighter clothing and went to grab something to eat. Larry organized the information he had gathered so far from the beginning. At 9:30, Masuka from the pathology department called to inform him that the test results were ready. Indeed, red wine was found in the stomach contents, and ketamine was detected in the blood from the heart. As for the various blood samples sent by Max and analyzed by DEXTER, tests revealed they came from two individuals. One was the murdered man, and the other was unknown. The database comparison was still ongoing, but no matches had been found yet. Sergeant Dokes, reviewing the results with Larry, said, "Although we can obtain DNA samples, they can only be used as identification evidence. We haven't found the murder weapon, and there's no conclusive proof. Now, all we can do is wait for the hair sample you found, which is currently being analyzed. Yes, it might lead us to the accomplice." "That's pretty good. Have you tried reconstructing the crime?" Larry nodded. "Wait until the others come down. Then, we'll go to the meeting and discuss it in detail. Yeah, we need to wrap this up quickly. I fear this case will attract public interest." Dokes knew that the murdered men would soon be thoroughly investigated. 40 minutes later, 3 people appeared in the task force's meeting room. Everyone in the room was holding a cup of coffee, and as the air conditioner blades oscillated, the smell of coffee spread to every corner of the room. Larry rubbed his nose. He found it hard to get used to the police special project team meetings, as the coffee scent was everywhere. Although he also drank coffee and smoked, he never did so during work hours. But most of the detectives here were constantly working overtime, so a cup of coffee was absolutely essential for them. For this particular case, Lieutenant Maria LaGuerta introduced the individuals who would participate externally to ensure the case was solved. In the meeting room were the director of the Public Security Bureau, high-ranking political officials, and legal representatives. "All right, Luke, I'll leave it to you," said Maria as she stepped aside. Larry nodded to everyone. "Forensic Dr. Luke, we just want to hear the investigative opinions of your criminal technology department. On our end, the investigation has reached a dead end because we have absolutely nothing conclusive. So far, what we know is that the apartment building's surveillance cameras were broken, and the only footage we recovered came from some nearby establishments, but it's not enough. Additionally, the murder victim was a relatively well-known manager in the real estate industry. There's a lot of pressure from all sides. It would be great if we could reconstruct the crime scene." Larry nodded, clicked on a folder on the computer, now connected to the projector, and opened the investigation and autopsy photos. At the moment he lowered his head, Larry saw Max beside him using a wallpaper cutter to cut the plastic ties wrapped around the electrical cables. His eyes lit up, and he instantly understood his previous doubts. "After investigating the site and conducting the autopsy, I have concluded that this was a crime of passion." Are we listening to him now? So young, and it seems like he's taking all our jobs. Angel, sitting among the detectives who were paying attention to the importance of this case for public interest, still didn't understand Larry's significance in technical crimes like this one. "That's because that son of a bitch is a damn criminal profiler. From what I read, even the FBI was interested in his talents, but he refused to join them and instead chose to work with us. Vince Masuka, who had been uneasy since Larry's arrival due to his own feelings of inferiority, whispered to Angel what he knew. A criminal profiler. Angel knew Larry was good, but he had never been interested in learning more about his work. Now that he knew all the titles Larry held, he respected him. It's important to understand that a criminal profiler is a specialist in criminology and forensic psychology who works within police departments, government agencies, or security forces. Their primary function is to analyze behavioral patterns at crime scenes, interpret criminal psychology, and develop profiles that help identify and capture suspects. It was uncommon to have a specialist like this in the department, especially when his main role was as a pathologist. Now it made sense why he only got involved in complex cases and why everyone had to listen to his words. Dexter, a quiet man, looked at Larry and whispered, "He's dangerous." The speed at which Larry Luke was transferred to their department had been suspiciously fast. Dexter hadn't had time to study him. And for some reason, Larry had really good connections. Over the past month, Dexter had been compiling a profile on this forensic expert, who was now also proving to be an exceptionally intelligent criminal profiler. From what he could tell, Larry had a dark past he was running from. That's why he hadn't joined the FBI, despite having the resources to be an invaluable asset to their investigations. Dexter had ruled out the possibility that Larry was from internal affairs when he first witnessed his work. And now, with Masuka completing the final details of Larry's profile, he finally knew what kind of person he was dealing with. Larry was an extremely tactical profiler, obsessed with finding details others missed, just so he could lock up criminals with nothing more than a few statements on the official paperwork. His ability to study cases and victims put him in the highest category of danger for Dexter. He knew he had to stay far away from Larry, or else he'd start finding flaws in the system Dexter had been exploiting to his advantage. He's definitely smart. Dexter murmured in a stoic tone, expressing both his thoughts and his complete lack of interest in joining the conversation. That guy is the closest we'll ever get to working with a killer. Trust me, don't mess with him. Masuka muttered under his breath. Angel laughed, but Dexter thought, you would never suspect that I, your friend and co-worker, the one you've been working with all this time, am a serial killer, a predator of predators. After investigating the scene and performing the autopsy, I've concluded that this was an intelligent, premeditated crime of passion. Larry's opening statement shocked everyone, followed by an explosion of murmurs. Lieutenant LaGuardia tightened her grip on her pen and asked, "Do you have any evidence?" "Of course, I do." Larry had analyzed everything in detail and explained, based on the stomach content analysis, the deceased had seafood for dinner and drank a lot of red wine. I believe Sergeant Dokes has already checked the victim's order records, correct? Sergeant Dokes nodded, stepped forward with some documents, and quickly reported, "Just before this meeting, I received a call from the technician analyzing the details. It has been confirmed that the deceased called the hotel reception at 9:30 p.m. on December 24th to order a meal. The delivery arrived at the victim's residence at 10:30 p.m. The meal consisted of 2 seafood dishes, red wine, and dessert. They also agreed to have the dishes picked up the next day, but the victim could not be contacted. We also checked the room's call records and found the delivery person's number among the missed calls." Larry nodded slightly, confirming his theory, and continued his explanation. "Secondly, we extracted a blood sample directly from the victim's heart for analysis. The results revealed a high concentration of ketamine, known in forensic science as K-powder. It's well documented that, in many cases where a woman commits a crime, she first poisons the victim before carrying out the murder. After all, the difference in physical strength between a man and a woman is significant, and ketamine is an effective way to neutralize the target." Larry paused, changed the projected image, and continued, "Through testing the bloodstains found at the scene, we identified the DNA of 2 individuals on the black pattern tiles on the west side of the bathroom. These tiles were not cleaned by the killer, leaving crucial evidence behind. When we removed the body from the bathtub, we found 2 strands of hair over 60 centimeters long at the bottom. DNA testing is currently underway. If the genetic profile of these hairs matches the bloodstain that does not belong to the victim, we have 2 possibilities: either that person is the killer, or someone is trying to frame them." If it's the latter, the case becomes even more complicated. The murder weapon used to stab the victim had to be a single-edged knife, 1.8 centimeters wide and between 8 and 10 centimeters long. Its design was extremely thin, with a thickness of no more than 0.1 centimeters. At first, I couldn't identify what type of knife fit these characteristics, but when I entered the meeting room, I suddenly realized it was a box cutter. Since the murder weapon lacked proper grip protection, stabbing the victim in the chest also caused a cut on the attacker's hand. Based on the direction of the blood splatters, we can conclude that the attacker is left-handed. When Larry mentioned his findings, his eyes instinctively focused on Dexter for a few seconds before continuing his presentation. The victim had a single fatal wound to the chest, inflicted by a bladed weapon that pierced the heart between the third and fourth ribs. This caused pericardial tamponade, leading to death in a single strike. Lieutenant LaGuerta furrowed her brows, visibly confused. A box cutter used as a murder weapon. Considering how cleanly the killer covered their tracks, why use such a fragile tool when it breaks so easily? I believe the murderer wanted to conceal their medical knowledge. Larry responded firmly and continued, that's why they deliberately chose a box cutter. While these blades are prone to breaking, if the insertion angle is perfectly perpendicular to the wound, they can penetrate without difficulty. Not only was Maria LaGuerta left speechless by Larry's deduction, but the entire criminology department present at the meeting fell silent. After hearing this crime scene reconstruction, Sergeant Dokes felt like applauding how clean and precise the presentation had been. This was the first time they had witnessed Larry's full capabilities. He didn't always participate in crime scene investigations. Are you saying the killer is a medical professional or someone with extensive knowledge of anatomy? Angel asked incredulously from the crowd. Brilliant, it seems my explanation was well understood. Larry had made an effort to avoid using too many technical terms unfamiliar to most. So, even without great physical strength, they were able to kill the victim with surgical precision in a single strike. Angel thought this made perfect sense, explaining all the doubts they had so far about the murderer. Larry nodded slightly and stated, it's likely the killer has medical training. If they were well acquainted with the victim, that would explain why they were in the room together late at night, with the victim wearing only pajamas. After a brief pause to let his words sink in, Larry firmly continued, the killer's profile is as follows. A woman. Had an intimate relationship with the victim. Left-handed. Has an injury on her left hand. Studied medicine or worked in the medical field. Calm, intelligent, and highly skilled at evading suspicion. Larry showed a slight smile and, in a neutral tone, added, with these characteristics, solving the case shouldn't be that difficult, right? The criminology team exchanged glances, wondering where the hell Larry had come from. Maria LaGuerta nodded slightly. Without the skills of a specialist in Larry's field, this killer would probably have been found much later. Sergeant Dokes burst into laughter and said, it's not difficult. We finally have some light in this investigation. I don't think it's that easy. Larry murmured, thinking that if the killer had done all this to avoid being discovered, they wouldn't leave behind a mistake like that. A few minutes later, the deceased's phone records arrived. Through the phone directory and responses from his workplace, we found nearly 20 women with whom he had intimate relationships. I'll take care of that. While everyone worked on profiling potential suspects, Sergeant Dokes returned to where Larry was sitting, still deep in thought. Larry, the test results just came in. The hair sample and the other blood stain on the wall don't belong to the same person. Larry thought deeply for a moment, recalling his own interpretation of the killer and finding no omissions or mistakes. It seemed the case was taking a turn he least wanted. If those two hairs had been placed there by the killer, then that person's mind was truly terrifying. In such a tense and frightening environment, they had managed to keep the hair of other people. The psychological quality and planning ability of this person were far superior to those of ordinary people. Around 11:30 in the morning, some women arrived at the center for evaluation. The so-called identification was actually a blood test to compare DNA. Although this type of test is fast, it still takes 4 or 5 hours. That's why the hall was noisy, like a vegetable market. These women seemed to know each other. Some pushed each other, others spoke coldly, some had sad expressions, and others bit their nails with blank faces. Sergeant Dokes arrived at the scene, followed by a few detectives. The higher-ups trust Larry, but that doesn't mean we have to follow everything he says. For now, don't just focus on writing the report this afternoon. Keep an eye on him and don't make any mistakes, no matter what. If we're really going in the wrong direction with this investigation and it affects the case's progress, our department will take the fall for it. Angel nodded. Although Larry's way of doing things was different from theirs, he never wasted time with pleasantries and got straight to work. However, Larry's serious attitude toward the case still made many admire him. When it was almost time to leave work, Sergeant Dokes arrived with a pile of information. He was a smart guy. After seeing everything Larry had done, he directly blamed him for the time they had wasted so far. Standing next to Larry, he pointed with his chin at the impatient women outside the glass door. They say 3 women have already caused a scene. If this keeps up, my head's going to explode. All of them had relationships with the victim. Forensic Dr. Luke, do you think any of them are suspects? In fact, Larry had already observed them and found nothing suspicious. Moreover, none of the women had injuries on their left hands. Let's wait for the test results. My intuition tells me there's no killer here. Larry showed no guilt about this. Dokes' face darkened. He openly showed anger and impatience, but the corners of his lips curled up slightly. He knew that if Larry made them go in circles, all the wasted time would fall on him, and his relevance in the department would only remain in his role as a forensic doctor. This is insane. What's wrong? We checked his phone directory. The tech team also recovered all the text messages he had recently deleted. They're all from the victim's girlfriends. Larry didn't respond to his question. Instead, he looked at the women outside the window, carefully observing each of their expressions. Dead men, 2 different ways to contact him, both involving women, right? Yes. Larry then asked, why are there 2 modes of contact? Why? I also have 2 phones, one for regular work and another that stays at home. Dokes didn't understand what point Larry was trying to make. That's obvious, Sergeant. We all have a landline at home. However, for someone like the victim who traveled a lot for work, what sense does it make for these women to contact him through both phones? Why focus on that? Angel didn't think like Larry. He knew that as soon as he stumbled upon something as irrelevant as this, he should start investigating elsewhere. But this was the problem with detectives from the Metropolitan Police. They always tried to wrap things up quickly to avoid dragging out cases of this nature. Who benefits from having the prey behind the homicide department? A case like this, where the victim has no close ties to living people, wasn't as important for detectives to solve. If the deceased person weren't as significant as the victim in this case, the pressure to solve it would be much lower. That's why, for the first time, Larry was fully invested in this case. Here, he had total authority as a criminal profiler rather than a forensic expert who rarely got deeply involved in investigations. Of course, Larry wouldn't waste time on work where his skills weren't needed. Some cases were so simple that any forensic expert could find the details. But in this instance, since the forensic team had found nothing and most of the best experts were occupied, Larry was granted full freedom in this investigation. He couldn't mess it up, not if he wanted to stay in Miami longer. Did you hear us? Angel looked at Sergeant Dokes and said, makes sense. Now you're siding with him. Dokes rubbed his chin with both hands and, after massaging his jaw, said, why don't you think differently? This is a phone people use at the office and in their daily lives at home. Obviously, the other one was used for sex. His romantic life is detailed in the phone records. Larry shared his thoughts while silently analyzing different possibilities. You talk like you've been through this before. What does that matter? Angel could sense that Sergeant Dokes had no liking for Larry, and he understood why. This criminal profiler didn't bother trying to be likable. Come on, think. All right, wait, this can only mean something very simple. His private life is a complete mess. There, is that what you wanted to hear? Dokes couldn't believe he had to act like a schoolboy in class. Larry narrowed his eyes slightly, then suddenly turned and stared straight into Angel's eyes, who seemed more interested in learning some of his investigative methods. Instantly, Larry entered a state of self-analysis. A tall, handsome, and wealthy man who isn't married obviously wouldn't have anything to hide in his calls or messages. After all, those who know him are aware of certain things about his romantic life. Even if his private life is a mess, why use two phones for arranging his relationships? Angel asked himself while trying to see what Larry had noticed that he hadn't. Is he still hiding the fact that he has multiple partners? Larry walked over to the window that connected to the room where the women who had, or still had, a relationship with the victim were gathered. Look at those people outside the window. Angel walked up to the window, looked at all those women, and waited for Larry to continue. They all know each other. But they don't seem surprised by the existence of other lovers. As expected, there are insults, reflecting their desire to be superior to the others, but that doesn't change the fact that they know each other. Larry paused, then said, but the victim didn't try to hide his relationships with all of them. So, what haven't you seen, Angel? Given the victim's personality, he seemed proud of both his private and business life. So, what is he hiding? Who does he need to hide from? His phone, the one containing details of his relationships with these women, was hidden under the bed, a rather strange place to keep a phone. Meanwhile, the home phone was openly placed in the most visible area of the living room. Who does he need to hide his romantic life from? Suddenly, Angel realized something and hit the wall. That's it. There must be a woman who knows the victim's true nature. Her relationship with the victim is, in contrast, the closest one and the one that mattered most to him. And most likely, this person is the killer. Larry opened a folder containing information and pulled out a photo of the dead man's hand. And look at this picture. The deceased was wearing a ring on the ring finger of his left hand. If he wore it on that finger, it meant he was engaged or had someone very important in his life. But why did the ring disappear? In fact, we have the ring. However, it's not the same ring that was on the victim's finger before he died. Larry showed a photograph of the ring that the forensic team had taken and his own analysis that led to that conclusion. This was a mistake the previous forensic experts had overlooked, and if not for Larry, they probably wouldn't have noticed. At this point, Sergeant Dokes took the folder from Angel's hands, flipped through the photographs, and became visibly irritated. This is unusual. You've kept an extensive personal record that you haven't shared with the homicide department. Are you planning to write a book or something? Larry's expressionless face became 2 degrees colder. Would you like to investigate this alone? It's because of things like this that I'm much better at my job. The details others ignore are recorded in my mind. It seems you've completely forgotten what a criminal profiler does. What if this crime has led to more victims and you haven't noticed? Criminal profiling is an investigative technique that allows for the prediction of a criminal's identifying characteristics, criminological, socio-demographic, and personality traits, by analyzing psychological or behavioral evidence obtained from multiple sources, particularly the crime scene. From a didactic perspective, this work studies profiling from 4 angles: deductive, unknown offender, inductive, solved cases, geographic, and an innovative approach, indirect profiling. Detectives used this technique and were good at it, but there were levels, and Larry was at the top of the chain. There was no comparison between what a detective saw and what Larry could find, sense, and observe. Sergeant James Dokes' arrogance blinded him at times. He ignored the work at hand and instead focused on making offensive remarks, as if he were looking for something. Of course, Larry understood what he was doing, but did their psychology games work on him? Of course not. Dokes knew nothing, and his concerns about Larry possibly having some mental issues were none of his business. Larry already had therapy sessions with selected individuals, so if a complaint was filed, it would probably be heard. But he had no issues with these trivial matters. He actually found them amusing. Look. Angel, who had been ignoring Dokes, glanced at the photograph taken of the deceased's finger and the ring found in its place. Dokes focused on this and asked, "You mean the killer took the real ring, right?" "That's the case." "Why do the markings left by the deceased's ring look familiar?" Angel tilted his large face to take a closer look. "It looks like there's a row of letters." Larry smiled. Angel was very observant, at least he was trying. He pulled another photograph from a new folder and carefully examined the deceased's ring finger. In fact, he could detect more details in the photograph than by looking at the victim's hand at the crime scene. There seemed to be perfectly arranged English letters forming a circle around the mark left by the deceased's ring. At that moment, Masuka knocked on the door and entered, adjusting his glasses as he said, "The test results are in, and the blood samples from the scene don't match. However, the DNA sample from the hair matched the woman with the strong defenses sitting near the door. Her name is Jennifer Miller." These words made Sergeant Dokes, who had just found a lead, narrow his eyes as his expression grew more serious. "It seems that forensic Dr. Luke's analysis is completely correct, and the killer is trying to deceive us," Angel said, having no doubts about Larry's skills. "Such a meticulous mind is not something ordinary people possess." "Looks like we're dealing with a rather intelligent murderer," Masuka acknowledged, knowing that this case was the most complex they had encountered in recent months. "All right, I'll now lead the team to continue the investigation and find the victim's preferred woman," Larry said as he gathered the folders from the detective's hands. A few hours later, Larry had returned home to change clothes and rest a little. He was of no use to anyone if he was exhausted, so he decided to get some sleep. He didn't sleep much, he had too much to think about. "It's not about you again," Larry murmured as he entered a hidden room where a large board displayed numerous investigation routes. This was his most private work, his desire and ambition. Larry wanted to find the men who had murdered his family on Christmas Eve. He had worked in various places during his time as a student. He had shadowed a detective on cases and learned from his mentor, who was just like him. What he knew about his family's murderer was that he only killed on Christmas, his crimes were clean, and he was too intelligent. He toyed with the police, investigators, and detectives. His cases were complex, rarely connected to each other, and because of that, there was no extensive trail of his crimes. But Larry had followed him to Miami. He was here, and Larry was sure he would find him. "I will kill you." On the board were photos of Larry's murdered family. They had all been slaughtered. Before leaving the crime scene, the killer had staged it to look like a biblical offering. He placed the parents' bodies in their bed, with lit candles on each side and a cross drawn on their foreheads in blood. Lisa and Timothy, Larry's siblings, were positioned at the dining table with their hands clasped together, as if in prayer. On the wall, written in blood, was the phrase, "And the Lord said, I will wipe the wicked from the face of the earth." Genesis 6 verse 7. To the killer, Larry, the youngest son, had been chosen to survive, to wander in solitude and understand his family's punishment. The lost lamb. Luckily, Larry hadn't been home on the day of his family's murder. When he returned from a school trip, he was met by the police and news reports about the massacre of his family. Larry was traumatized, unable to comprehend why his home had become the scene of such an atrocity. Authorities initially classified the crime as a ritual murder unrelated to other cases, unaware that it was just another rehearsal for the doomsday killer. For the murderer, this crime was a success. He had proven that he could wipe out entire families and give their deaths a sacred meaning. Larry went mad trying to explain the signs, but no one listened to him. There was only one step left for the killer to reveal the coming apocalypse to the world. And Larry, who had studied him for years, knew it was only a matter of time before he resurfaced. His investigations had led him here, to Miami. December 27, 2005, Miami Metropolitan Police Department. Early in the morning, Larry entered the precinct courtyard. He had barely slept that night. Although he had long become desensitized to the crimes he solved and studied, every time he closed his eyes, he dreamt of all the details of the case he had discussed with his family. The perfectly arranged corpses, the biblical messages, and the lamb. He was trapped in a space filled with information he couldn't use to catch the criminal. There was no doubt he would catch him. He just needed the killer to start committing crimes again so he could study him. He still didn't know what he would do with all that information, but he was certain he would catch him. And when that moment came, Larry hoped he would have the patience to put him behind bars. Because if he started killing criminals like some kind of grim reaper, he feared that the urge to kill would become addictive. If that were the case, even all the criminals in the country wouldn't be enough to satisfy his addiction. His job was already enough for him, and at least this one was legal. Just as he parked his car, Captain Tom Matthews, LaGuardia's superior and practically the head of the entire department, appeared in front of the glass doors of the precinct. He hadn't been seen around for days, but now he suddenly showed up and looked towards the entrance. At the same time, Larry's cell phone rang. It was Inspector Mike Lowry calling. "Forensic Dr. Luke, my investigation has hit a dead end. Have you reviewed the documents? If you have time, could you come to the Midtown District Criminal Police Division? I'd like you to help me review some relevant investigation materials. My superiors are putting pressure on me, and we have a special project meeting this afternoon. I'll check my schedule and get back to you." Larry knew that many cases involved celebrities, powerful businessmen, or politicians. Detectives handling these kinds of crimes were usually under immense social pressure because the longer the case dragged on, the harder it became to solve. Besides, Inspector Mike Lowry was a pragmatic man, something Larry deeply appreciated. As he opened the car door and stepped out, Captain Tom Matthews had already spotted him and hurried over with his usual friendly smile. "Forensic Dr. Luke, I heard you took over the Christmas case. Do you have any leads?" Larry nodded slightly and paused before responding. "Everything is going well. Our team is about to attend a special project meeting." After hearing that, Captain Tom Matthews gave Larry a light pat on the arm. "If you run into any difficulties, report them immediately. Solving this case is our top priority. You're new here, so if you have any doubts, don't hesitate to ask. We'll be happy to help anytime." Tom Matthews knew Larry well. After all, he was the one secretly overseeing him at the request of the department's higher-ups. "All right, get to work." Larry didn't respond to the captain's words. He simply watched him walk up the stairs with a smile. "Oh," Larry scoffed slightly. What kind of condolence and concern was that? It was much easier to understand contempt or expressions of disgust than compliments. Thinking about this, Larry called Max, and together they headed straight to the meeting room for the morning session. Meanwhile, he also kept an eye on the case Mike had asked for his help with. Assisting detectives from different places was part of his job. His time as a student had been hectic. Not only had he worked with the FBI, but he had also collaborated with other departments under his professor's guidance. "Have you solved it already?" Max asked, knowing Larry's reputation. That was precisely why he had requested to be his apprentice. It's just mental work," Larry replied as they reached the homicide department's meeting room. The door was slightly ajar, so they pushed it open and entered. In the center of the room was a long table covered with stacks of paper documents. On the wall near the door was a whiteboard with the words, "The Christmas Case," along with Larry's sketch of the suspect and some crime scene photos pinned to it. At the sound of the door opening, the detectives and forensic analysts assisting Larry with data analysis looked up. "Come in quickly, our reinforcements have arrived." Dokes had assembled a formal team to solve the case. "We'll help Forensic Dr. Luke dig through this mountain of crap." Dokes' attitude had changed overnight. "Are you surprised?" Larry glanced at Angel and nodded slightly at the question. "Do we have everything about the victim's life?" "Yes, including all of their employees. We gathered this information while you were resting. In addition to details about personnel from various companies they had business ties with, we've marked every person the victim knew." The detectives in the group looked at the pile of documents with grim expressions. Dokes, of course, wasn't going to help them go through all the paperwork. "Damn, this is insane." Statements from all the women they had managed to interview yesterday were on the table, along with details about their lives and what they had done in the days leading up to the murder. Their partners, friends, cousins, everything was documented and laid out on the table. "This is going to take forever." Larry said nothing. He simply sat down and began reading the files carefully. Of course, Max followed Larry's lead and examined the information alongside his mentor. Angel dropped the box he was carrying, reluctantly sat down, and joined in. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rustling of paper. Larry flipped through the pages, mentally reconstructing the victim's entire life. Work, social life, making friends, and yes, owning a dog. Judging by its shiny golden fur, it must have been well taken care of. Where was the victim's dog groomed and bathed? At that moment, Larry posed the question while looking at a photo of the dog. Several detectives lifted their heads and looked at Larry. Yes, we investigated that. From what we found, the victim frequently took their dog to a veterinary hospital across from their workplace. That made sense, dropping the dog off across the street from work so they could pick it up at the end of the day. Larry nodded, picked up the sixth box of files, and as he opened it, some photos fell to the floor, catching his attention. This is interesting. Larry leaned down to pick up the photos and glanced at the outer cover of the file box that had also fallen to the floor. This was a human resources file from the real estate company with which the victim had many business dealings. The information collected was extremely detailed. It even included the family situation of every person close to the victim. The photos that had just fallen remained in Larry's hands. After a few moments of silence, he smiled. This is interesting. Angel heard Larry's words and stepped closer to see what he had found. Let me introduce you to the president of Empez Corporation, Mr. Christopher Hall. I remember reviewing some of his information, but now that I think about it, his story is far too interesting. Larry paused, moved the boxes to the center of the table, and placed a photograph of the man in question. Like any successful middle-aged man, Christopher is nearly 50 years old, has no children, but his wife is very young and beautiful. Wait a second, even though Christopher Hall's wife, Amanda Hall, is a beautiful woman, there's no way she has any connection to the victim, right? Well, that idea isn't so crazy, considering the couple is currently going through a divorce. Max, standing beside Larry, looked up and held up some documents in his hands. Larry flipped through all the information in the box and found Christopher Hall's file. Just as Max had said, his wife's information was attached to the same folder. Although there were only a few lines of text, the details were quite specific. Name, Amanda Hall. Gender, female. Age, 36. Education, graduated from Johns Hopkins University with a degree in pharmacology, but as the wife of a successful businessman, she never pursued a career in her field, remaining a full-time housewife. Pharmacology. Larry knew that Johns Hopkins University was one of the best for studying medicine, one of the very best. That was why everything clicked in his mind, and he wanted to confirm his suspicions. Larry stood up, took the information, and pinned the photos on the board. Everyone in the room stopped what they were doing and looked at him in confusion. Larry used magnets to hold the photos together, then took a magnifying glass from the table and handed it to Sergeant Dokes, who was standing beside him. Look closely. What do you want me to see, Luke? I'm not here for preschool lessons. Sergeant Dokes was different from the rest. He found it hard to admit that Larry was far better at investigative work than he was. The press photograph showed a man and a woman. The man appeared agitated, waving his hands and shouting something. The woman, on the other hand, was dignified and beautiful, with a colorful shawl draped over her right arm. She looked calm, holding her hair with her left hand, and the background appeared to be a yacht. Larry paused before saying, "Look at the woman's right hand." Through the magnifying glass, Sergeant Dokes carefully observed the woman's hand. On the ring finger of her right hand was a large diamond ring, at least 1 carat in weight. A gold ring, worn on the ring finger of her left hand, was densely inscribed with English letters on the front. As Dokes examined the photograph and focused on the woman's hand, he carefully considered whether this was truly a mistake. When was this photograph taken? The press delivered it this morning. It's not hard to find a woman like her when they're constantly following her husband. Larry looked around the room and said, "Analyzing this woman's profile, we can determine that she's left-handed, studied medicine, and is wearing the same ring that was replaced on the victim." Are you saying she's the one? Yes, you can arrest her. A crime of passion wasn't much of a challenge for Larry, now that he had been gifted with almost limitless knowledge. As an analyst, he had access to a massive database of criminals who had yet to be caught. The traces he was following were annoying because he wasn't dealing with a serial killer. Originally, he thought he might find the murderer at the dog care center near the victim's workplace. Larry had found that theory appealing, but unexpectedly, love was the driving force behind this case. Perhaps it was emotional attachment. The woman who killed the victim wasn't as clever as she believed. When Larry concluded the investigation, everyone seemed pleased, and Sergeant Dokes personally congratulated him, even though they hadn't yet definitively concluded that she was the murderer. The real work now fell to the detectives. Dealing with a woman whose intelligence was above average was going to be extremely complex. They all had to rely on Larry's analysis if they wanted to catch her. "Do you want to come to the arrest?" Angel asked, glancing at the gun on Larry's belt. His service weapon. Everyone working in Larry's position had a service weapon. His status and credentials allowed him to carry a gun as if he were an officer himself. The reason was simple: people like him often got too involved in crimes and could suddenly find themselves face to face with a killer at any moment. But Larry wasn't stupid, at least he knew when to stop. A woman. That doesn't sound very interesting. I'd let you be the one to put the cuffs on her. Masuka would really appreciate that. Angel whispered to Larry while looking at the woman's photographs on the board. Larry, understanding what Angel meant, gave a subtle smile and said, "I'll leave that to you. I have a headache." "All right, I'll fill you in later over a beer. I'm sure the sergeant will cover the tab." Angel smirked, locking eyes with the sergeant as he followed him to the arrest. "I don't drink much." Larry only had a vodka drink when he couldn't sleep. It helped him more than some medications. At noon, Amanda Hall was arrested and taken to headquarters for questioning. Larry, who was on the second floor reading over a colleague's case file, heard the car doors slamming just outside the main entrance. Closing the lunchbox he had just opened, Larry walked over to the window and looked down. To his surprise, he moved just in time to see the woman being dragged inside by the detectives. He immediately noticed that Amanda's left arm was in a cast, yet she still maintained an air of pride despite being escorted in. "I can walk on my own. I'm not going anywhere, officer." Amanda adjusted the folds of her white dress and gracefully entered the building. Larry perked up his ears. What a great disguise. Sergeant Dokes' call quickly came through to the pathology department. "We brought her to the station. We're requesting a search warrant for the raid. We'd also like Dexter to come in for analysis." Masuka, who took the call, nodded and said, "No problem. I'll make sure the suspect's blood sample gets sent to the lab." Larry, hearing this, thought for a moment and asked, "Could I watch the interrogation?" Masuka looked at Larry and said, "That's also why they called. You're needed." "Well, let's hope this goes smoothly," Larry said, walking toward the adjacent room, the interrogation room, and stepped inside. As expected, there was a surveillance camera that directly captured the interrogation room. Amanda sat calmly in the chair, lifted her right leg, and crossed it over her left knee, yawning slightly. There was no trace of fear. Occasionally, she glanced at the glass on Larry's side with a hint of understanding in her eyes. An hour passed, and the officer in charge of questioning had run out of ideas. Larry frowned slightly. His assessment was correct. The results of the blood analysis would soon provide the most compelling evidence. But how did these two people's lives overlap? One was a corporate executive. The other is a full-time housewife. From childhood to adulthood, there had been no close contact between them. As he observed the interests and hobbies of both individuals and listened to Amanda talk about all her friends and acquaintances, Larry suddenly stopped his fingers, which had been moving non-stop in simple exercises to activate his neurons. Larry grabbed Angel's shoulder and asked, "Do you remember the golden retriever the victim had?" Angel looked him in the eyes, a hint of excitement flashing in his gaze. "That's the connection. If she has denied knowing him and we have evidence to the contrary, we'll have the upper hand in the interrogation." Amanda's best friend had opened a pet hospital right in front of the building where the victim worked. The victim often left the golden retriever at that pet hospital. Maybe they had known each other for a long time but had become familiar with each other through this connection. Could this be the breakthrough? Angel called Sergeant Dokes, who was in charge of the interrogation, handed him the tablet with the information, and whispered something to him. The sergeant looked at Angel for a brief moment before returning to the interrogation room. Seeing how confident the police officer was, Amanda slightly squinted her right eye. Her psychological defenses were about to collapse. As medical students, they had all been exposed to psychology to some extent, making them naturally skilled in investigation and counter-investigation. That's why, when the perpetrator in a case is a doctor, dealing with them is extremely difficult. Sergeant Dokes handed her a cigarette and said, "I heard you graduated from a prestigious medical university." In the US, the income in this industry is so high. Why abandon a discipline that cost you so much to learn? This was probably the first question everyone wanted to ask upon seeing Larry. My husband has an enormous fortune. Why wear myself out working for others for a few $1,000s? If I have the world in my hands, surely everyone would do the same. The world in your hands? Ha ha ha. Sergeant Dokes burst out laughing, while Larry was left speechless. This guy has a very strange sense of humor if something like that makes him laugh. Seeing that there was no progress in the interrogation room, Larry's frown deepened. By the way, Angel, can we remove the cast from that woman's hand? Angel's smile froze instantly, revealing a trace of concern. If it's a real fracture, removing it could worsen the injury or cause further damage. Larry's face darkened immediately. You don't trust my judgment. It's not about trust. Sergeant Dokes will bury you alive if we're wrong for any reason. Angel had started to enjoy his friendship with Larry, so he didn't want him off the investigation. Working with him was extremely comfortable. Larry looked through the window into the interrogation room and saw that Amanda's exposed fingertips weren't swollen or showing signs of poor circulation, so it was definitely not a fracture. Without saying another word, he rummaged through his inspection kit and found an electric saw on the lower shelf. Angel knew he had just provoked Larry's pride. Underestimating his skills was the worst thing anyone could do to a man considered a genius. Though Larry was a man of few words, he had an obstinate temperament. Once he became stubborn, nothing and no one could stop him, so Angel simply followed him. Angel, trailing behind Larry, watched as he pushed open the interrogation room door. I'd like to interrupt this interrogation. Mrs. Hall, let me introduce you to forensic Dr. Luke. Though annoyed, Sergeant Dokes didn't stop Larry when he realized his intentions. If he could get rid of this lunatic, he'd be better off working the traditional way. Please cooperate. Larry stepped forward and began cutting off Amanda's left arm cast. At that moment, a flicker of panic flashed in Amanda's eyes. Stop. My hand is injured. You're violating my human rights. I'll sue you. Larry acted as if he hadn't heard her. Amid a burst of white smoke and the sharp sound of electric saws, with Angel's help, he removed the cast. At first glance, they found a large piece of gauze wrapped around Amanda's left index finger. Larry carefully removed the gauze. Amanda closed her eyes, her lips trembling slightly. Sure enough, there was a wound at the base of her index finger that had been sutured but had not yet scabbed over. What a bitch. Angel, now fully involved, couldn't help but spit out the insult upon seeing that every detail Larry had pointed out was true. There was no comparison between standard detective investigations and what Larry had just done. Now Angel understood him better. Though the method had been somewhat aggressive, being able to find direct evidence like this was the biggest blow to a suspect. The results of the DNA comparison between the suspect and the blood found at the scene will be sent in immediately. After Larry finished speaking, he began sorting the cast fragments. Once a person's psychological defenses break, all disguises become useless. Amanda asked Sergeant Dokes for a cigarette. Larry knew that was a sign she was about to confess, so he quickly left the interrogation room. At that moment, Larry's phone rang. It was Max, his forensic assistant. Larry assumed they must have found some evidence at Amanda's house, so he asked, "What did you find?" Max, who had taken on the important mission of acting as an inspector while Masuka handled the forensic investigation, laughed on the other end of the call. Masuka will tell you, you can't even imagine what we found. Masuka, who snatched the phone from Max, said, "You were right, the murder weapon was a box cutter." I don't know whether to praise this woman for her high intelligence or call her stupid. After killing someone, she took the murder weapon home. Larry was a little puzzled. You actually found the murder weapon in her house. Doesn't that go against everything she had done so far? Killers think outside the box. For her, it was really unfortunate that she hid the murder weapon in an urn inside a sort of shrine on the second floor of her house, where her mother's ashes were also kept. Well then, see you at the station. Oh, right. Along with the box cutter, there were 2 matching rings that belonged to the deceased and Amanda. The dog led us to that spot. Larry narrowed his eyes slightly. Even a dog could smell it, which meant there was blood. Looks like there's blood on the knife. You guessed right. There's blood on both the blade and the handle. The evidence in this case is solid. Masuka sounded quite excited. Then, let's play a game. What game? Larry felt a bit uneasy since he wasn't close enough to Masuka to call him a friend. Guess. What color is the murder weapon? Larry replied lazily, stop playing games with my deductions. I'm not a superhero. Just make sure Dexter does his job properly. If you're not afraid of being wrong, just play along. Larry thought for a moment, and suddenly the image of the ring in the photo appeared in his mind. All right, yellow. Masuka fell silent on the other end of the call, and after a few seconds, he shouted, oh my God. Are you really a superhuman? No. Wait, Max, you bastard, does this phone have some kind of hidden camera? That doesn't exist. Don't lie to me. Larry didn't wait to hear any more nonsense and hung up the phone, ignoring Max's continued accusations. In the interrogation room, Amanda confessed everything in no time. Amanda Hall. 36 years old. She graduated from Johns Hopkins University with a degree in pharmacology and married a successful businessman who was 15 years older than her, apparently for financial reasons. She and the victim first met at a dinner abroad, organized by a company that had business relations with her husband's company. However, their real familiarity began 2 years ago when they coincidentally met at the pet hospital of her best friend. The victim was attractive, tall, and had a well-maintained physique. His experience with women made him quite skilled in the art of seduction. Although Amanda's husband was more successful in his career, he couldn't compare to the victim in terms of looks and conversation. Additionally, when Amanda married, her husband was already middle-aged, and she had never truly experienced the feeling of being in love. After just a few days of interaction, Amanda fell for the victim. After some encounters, the two soon developed a deeper relationship. With Amanda's help, the victim was directly promoted to deputy general manager. At that time, the victim became arrogant. More and more women surrounded him, and he had 12 regular lovers. Amanda, who was deeply in love with him, made him a solemn promise. He kept saying that he wouldn't marry anyone but Amanda and that they would get married as soon as she got divorced. However, the victim took into account what he had told Amanda only in moments of passion. One night, just a month ago, Amanda went directly to the victim's apartment without notifying him in advance. That night, Amanda only wanted to surprise him. She had already filed for divorce and had also discovered that her husband was having an affair. She was about to receive a large share of his assets. But when she opened the door and stepped inside the house, she saw 2 red high heels casually thrown on the floor at the entrance. Amanda was surprisingly calm. She entered the room barefoot and silently. The master bedroom door was slightly ajar, and the man she loved was role-playing with one of his lovers. The scene before her sent shivers down her spine, and she felt as if her emotions had been tainted. She didn't make a noise or interrupt the couple's wild lovemaking. The scent of pheromones made her nauseous, and she wanted to escape. At that moment, Amanda turned around and left silently, later hiring a private detective to investigate. After the investigation, she discovered that the man who had sworn his heart to her hadn't remained unmarried because he was waiting for her. He was simply a womanizer who loved to go from woman to woman every night. In just 1 month, he had been with more than 20 different women. Amanda then realized that she was just another number, someone easy to sleep with. She detested being just a number. Then she came to a realization. Through personal experience, she knew she could only rely on herself. Amanda disappeared for more than 20 days under the pretense of traveling. Even though her lover was a playboy, he truly loved Amanda. After the victim learned about Amanda's return date, he arranged a meeting with her for the day before Christmas. She carefully selected a sharp knife that could not be traced. She placed the magic powder that her husband had hidden at home into a heart-shaped pendant around her neck. That night, Amanda arrived at the meeting as promised. After a candlelit dinner, they had a passionate lovemaking session after a long separation. Amanda personally served the men a glass of red wine with the magic powder. Afterward, Amanda took the initiative to ask to go to the bathroom once, and the victim didn't notice anything unusual. That idiot fell right into her charms. Afterward, as the victim sat in the bathtub, he was completely unsuspecting. He enjoyed Amanda's touch and immersed himself in the bliss of the magic powder. At that moment, Amanda pulled out the knife hidden in the pocket of her pajamas. The knife plunged into the victim's chest. As soon as the victim sensed something was wrong, he slowly raised his arms and looked at Amanda and his own wound in shock. Then, as she pulled the knife out, he slid into the bathtub and half closed his eyes. Seeing that she had blood on her hand, Amanda quickly found a pair of latex gloves in the bathroom and put them on, turned on the bathtub faucet, and cleaned all the rooms. She returned to the bathroom and rinsed off all the blood, blocked the bathtub drain, dropped 2 long hairs from one of the victim's lovers into the bottom of the tub, and turned on the cold water valve. She didn't kill the victim's golden retriever because it was a charming dog. Larry lightly shook his head after reading the report and said, "This person's possessiveness has exceeded the scope of normal cognition. It's a kind of mental illness." She got married right after graduating, became a full-time housewife, and had no children. Her living space was limited, and she lived entirely in her own world. So she believed love had to be pure, but her lover destroyed the pure love she had finally found. She killed the victim just to possess him completely. Larry analyzed the woman as soon as he read her statements. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Angel placed the investigation box he was holding on the table. Angel approached with curiosity, wiping the sweat from his face, and asked, "Well," she confessed. "Do you know if the physical evidence has been sent for DNA extraction?" Angel nodded and said, "You don't look exhausted. You're in here using the air conditioning, while I'm out there hungry and hot. I did all the hard work today, brother." Larry looked grim as he glanced at the car keys on the table. "Didn't you enjoy driving my vehicle?" "I wasn't comfortable." "Well." Larry imagined why and said, "The case is closed. Let's head back." At that moment, Masuka entered and asked, "Holy hell, that woman is even more beautiful in person than in photos." Angel and Larry fell silent, staring at Masuka. Dexter, who was following behind him, said in a monotone voice, "That's true. You hear that? Dexter and I have similar tastes in women. Let's get out of here." Angel never thought of a female killer in a romantic way. After walking down the stairs and standing under the scorching sun, Larry stopped. Angel, Masuka, and Dexter, who were behind him, almost bumped into him. "Who's paying for dinner tonight?" "Huh. Well, Larry, knowing you hold 2 positions at the station and your salary must be double, you should be the one treating us tonight." Masuka, like an old sly fox, adjusted his glasses and walked over to Larry's side. Angel placed his hand on Larry's shoulder and said, "I know a good place." "Then let's eat." Masuka smiled and, looking at Dexter, asked, "Are you coming?" "No, I have a special dinner with Rita." "Lucky bastard. I'd like to clarify in advance that we're not going to any 5-star hotels. The meal cost cannot exceed $200, otherwise, I'd rather go to a fast food restaurant." "Don't talk nonsense, let's go." From behind, Dexter watched Larry, who had, on this occasion, taken away a prey he could have easily killed. Without a doubt, as a criminal profiler, Larry had demonstrated his skills, and if Dexter wanted to beat him at finding victims, he would have to slow down his work. However, if he made a mistake, Larry could uncover him, and his facade as a good bloodstain analyst would be exposed. Without a doubt, he needed to investigate him further. Late at night, Miami Metropolitan Police Department. Lieutenant Maria LaGuerta's office. Sergeant Dokes entered her office and asked, "Are you really going to tell me who Larry Luke is and why we have him in our department?" Originally, he was just a forensic specialist assigned directly to the pathology department, but his skills as a criminal profiler shouldn't be wasted. He has already proven what he's capable of by solving your case in less than 48 hours. He's a complete robot. He has no consideration for others. He's a criminal profiler, James. He needs to be given the necessary attention and listened to so that the workload in the field is less burdensome. Maria knew what Larry was capable of because she had received recommendations from the FBI about him. Everyone wanted Larry on their team. There were even other departments in Miami that would welcome a criminal profiler like him with open arms. Not everyone knew Larry's history. Few were aware of the cases he had worked on, and even fewer knew who had trained him. Larry is the closest we'll ever get to working with a killer, but he's our colleague. Stop making those veiled comments, Maria scolded, fully aware of James and his tendency to harass anyone he considered a potential threat. Does he receive psychological evaluations? Yes, he has to be under constant review. We don't oversee the results, but we do ensure they are carried out. Maria glanced at Larry's file and added, besides, it's not my place to tell you this, but forensic Dr. Luke's family was murdered by a serial killer. Then, Sergeant Dokes felt a chill run down his spine. The FBI believes Larry found a series of clues and that the killer is now somewhere in Miami. Our colleague needs support, and we are going to provide it. Understood. When James left the room, Maria looked at the papers in her hands and murmured, this could be the best thing that's ever happened to us, or a problem that will only get worse. Somewhere in Miami, late at night, Dexter was following his usual routine, tracking one of his new victims. But his thoughts kept drifting to a much bigger problem that had been bothering him, Larry, who, until now, hadn't shown much. To Dexter, Larry was a problem. Not the kind you could ignore, like a jammed printer or a vending machine that eats your money. No, Larry was the kind of problem that breathes, watches, and analyzes. The kind of problem that doesn't stop until it finds the exact missing piece of the puzzle. And now, he worked in his department. Not just as a simple pathologist, which would already be annoying enough, but also as a criminal profiler. He had proven that he could catch minds like mine with an alarmingly low margin of error. His success rate was nearly perfect, a symphony of deduction, insight, and obsession. But something brought him here, to this department, to a place where secrets usually remain silent and unnoticed. Something made him change course, abandon active hunting with the FBI, and seek refuge in the cold comfort of corpses with little history and their eloquent silence. Or at least, that's what he wants everyone to believe. I've been watching Larry since the first day he set foot in the department. He's meticulous, methodical, and, above all, disturbingly perceptive. He moves through the department with a calmness that feels too calculated. He doesn't just dissect bodies or examine remains. No, Larry studies them, interrogates them in his mind, and extracts truths that no one else would even think to look for. And he's looked at me. Several times. With that glint in his eyes that feels vaguely familiar. As if he were dissecting me instead of a corpse on the table. The question is, what does he see when he looks at me? Does he see the meticulous blood spatter analyst that everyone else thinks they know? Or is there something more in his gaze, something that suggests my facade isn't as perfect as I thought? I've tested his perception with small details. Tiny changes in my routine, slight variations in my reports. Loose threads that, if he was really paying attention, he'd notice don't quite fit. And he has. His questions are subtle, disguised as simple curiosity, but they don't fool someone like me. He's searching for something. He doesn't know exactly what, but doubt has taken root in his mind. And if there's one thing I know about profilers, it's that once a question nests in their brain, they don't let go until they find the answer. And that makes me vulnerable. It's not that I've made mistakes, not the kind that would get me caught immediately. But Larry doesn't need irrefutable proof. His skill isn't in finding fingerprints or DNA traces. His expertise lies in behavior. Patterns. Instinct. And that's a playing field where the rules aren't in my favor. So now, I have to make decisions. Watch him as he watches me. Become his shadow, find his weaknesses before he finds mine. There can't be two predators in the same jungle without one eventually ending up on top. The problem is, Larry doesn't know he's in danger. He thinks he's playing a game of intellect, one where truth and logic are his weapons. But I don't play by the same rules. And if Larry isn't careful, he could end up being more than just a problem. He could end up being a memory. Hey, buddy, are you planning to stay parked here forever? Dexter, snapped out of his thoughts, turned to see a man shining a flashlight at him and said, "I'll move now." "Then do it before I call the cops." "Yeah, good night." On his way home, Dexter thought, maybe I should become his friend. Larry's house. After returning from a party that had lasted longer than expected, Larry sat in his living room, staring at a painting. It was his own creation, an abstract human figure merging with darkness, dressed in a black suit. His emotions were sometimes expressed through paintings, no one but him knew that. But this was his most dangerous desire, the wish to become a sort of judge of death. He wanted to make the living suffer moments before they were killed in dangerous trials that challenged their will to survive. This kind of punishment had to be witnessed by the whole world. Larry wanted his targets to be known for the murderers they were. Those who had made others suffer should watch as those scumbags suffered and got what they deserved. Larry wanted to do the same to the men who had murdered his family. In fact, he had spent years developing complex trials that he could carry out at any moment. But with the current level of technology, his murders wouldn't go unnoticed. That's why it wasn't time yet. Larry didn't feel ready to bring justice to those who had dedicated their lives to harming others. Not yet. The next morning, Captain Thomas Matthews rushed to the homicide department. When he opened the door, he only found Masuka talking with Angel while they sipped coffee, but Larry was nowhere to be seen. Has the forensic Dr. Luke not arrived yet? Angel quickly stood up from his desk and said, "Dr. Luke is here. He just stepped outside for a smoke. Do you need me to leave him a message?" "No, just remind Luke not to act recklessly in his investigations. Later, he'll realize that some of the things he does might not be entirely legal." "Are we talking about Luke?" Masuka thought for a moment but couldn't recall Larry ever acting improperly in his investigations. In fact, as the chief forensic expert, his mental state was considered abnormal, but that was normal for people working in forensics. Understood. Angel, on the other hand, thought that Captain Thomas Matthews was here because of what they had done the day before with Amanda's hand. Now that he thought about it more clearly, if, for some reason, that woman really had her entire hand, the trouble they would have faced would have been far greater than they could imagine. "By the way, how's the progress on the case you're working on?" Angel finished eating the donut he had in his hand and nearly choked upon hearing that question. He blinked several times and looked at Captain Thomas Matthews with a perplexed expression. "Which case?" Captain Thomas Matthews was so angry that his old eyebrows trembled slightly. Holding his forehead, he asked, "Which case? Weren't you working on the Christmas case? Do you not even remember what cases you've handled?" "Holy God!" Masuka murmured, thinking that his captain, on the verge of retirement, might be suffering from some memory issues. Angel, who understood shortly after what his captain was referring to, took off his hat and said, "Well, you mean the Christmas case with the successful man, right? The case was solved last night, and the suspect confessed. For a moment, I thought our department was working on another huge case. I thought the same. I assumed he was talking about the prostitute's case." Masuka joined Angel's conclusion as he finished his cup of coffee. Captain Thomas Matthews' angry expression shifted to one of surprise. The case was solved. None of us would have thought that a criminal profiler was what we needed to speed up our work. While we're out in the field, Larry takes care of the primary investigation. Yeah, well, I'd prefer if they left control of the pathology department to me. Masuka still feared that his position might be given to Larry after he had demonstrated his potential. Captain Thomas Matthews didn't dwell on Masuka's nonsense. Instead, he focused on the Christmas case. Less than 48 hours had passed from the moment the crime occurred to the moment the suspect confessed. Since then, Lieutenant LaGuardia's report had indicated that the description of the killer given by forensic Dr. Luke was quite accurate. But when Matthews had gone to rest, nothing had happened yet, nor had he been informed. And now, it turns out the case was solved, and he was the last to know. I wasn't informed. Well, that was supposed to be Sergeant Doak's job. It could be considered a miracle that a murder case with no leads was solved in 48 hours. All the homicide detectives thought the same as the captain. But for those who had worked with Larry, they knew this was no miracle. The captain nodded, trying his best to smooth the wrinkles on his face. That lieutenant trying to bypass me again, damn it. After Captain Thomas Matthews finished speaking, he didn't wait for Angel to respond and quickly left the office. Except for the team investigating the Christmas case, all the other detectives were in the department. This room was large, shared by all the other detectives, with desks close to their colleagues, meaning everyone had heard exactly what had happened. Well, I'll pretend I didn't hear any of that and keep eating my donut, Angel said as he started talking about other things with Masuka. Yeah, I'll do the same. 20 minutes later, Larry had returned from the evidence vault to finalize details of his investigation. On his way to his desk, Larry ran into Dexter in the hallway. He nodded slightly and stepped aside to let him pass. Dexter, however, didn't rush as he usually did. Instead, he raised his hand to help Larry with his large investigation files. Dr. Luke, I'm sorry I couldn't make it to dinner last night. Larry, who had originally been in a hurry to send some files to a friend, paused and said, well, you'll be able to attend another gathering. Well, this time, I'll have to invite you. Dexter looked at Larry, who had a calm expression, and patted him on the shoulder. Larry observed Dexter's expression and asked, so, is your specialty blood spatter analysis? Yes, I do something similar to a criminal profiler, except instead of investigating, I just receive the data and reconstruct the crime scene to find details that were previously missed. Larry smiled and said objectively, unfortunately, as forensic doctors, there's not much we can do. Everything depends on the criminal police. Whether or not they catch our target is entirely in their hands. Dexter chuckled and said, if we're fast, the detectives will finish their job even faster. On their way back, Larry chatted with the peculiar Dexter, who now seemed more interested in talking to him than on any other day. To Larry, Dexter Morgan was a methodical, organized, and highly intelligent man. His work as a forensic analyst specializing in blood spatter at the Miami Metropolitan Police Department allowed him to navigate crime scenes with ease. At first glance, he appeared to be a reserved individual, with dry humor and an impeccable professional attitude. However, certain traits in his behavior caught Larry's attention. Dexter exhibited an almost inhuman level of emotional control. He showed no signs of stress or anxiety in situations where most people would feel some degree of discomfort. His ability to remain unshaken by violent scenes, even seeming to enjoy them at times, suggested an unusual emotional detachment. His social interactions are correct but forced. Larry then realized that it was evident Dexter had learned to replicate expected behaviors rather than experience them genuinely. His relationship with his sister, Deborah Morgan, at the station was peculiar. There was undeniable affection, but Morgan's expression was awkward and lacked real emotional depth. With this in mind, Larry had no doubt that Dexter followed a similar pattern in his romantic relationships. He acted as expected, but with an underlying disconnection. However, the most intriguing aspect was his life structure. Dexter was a man of strict routines. He always arrived at work at the exact same time, avoided abrupt changes in his daily life, and maintained an almost obsessive control over his free time. He left no room for improvisation, indicating an extreme need for control. Despite these traits, there was nothing about him that suggested a particularly conspicuous hidden agenda. Perhaps he was simply a man with emotional attachment issues, or someone who, due to his job, had developed a natural insensitivity to violence. A possible childhood trauma could explain his emotional disconnection, but without additional information, pinpointing its origin was impossible. In summary, to Larry, Dexter Morgan was a peculiar individual but not remarkable enough to obsess over. He was efficient, solitary, and meticulous. Maybe he was just a man who had learned to survive in a world he didn't fully understand. When Larry returned to the homicide department with Dexter, both went to their respective workstations after finishing their conversation. Do you have your report ready? The captain seems to be in a bad mood today. Well, he can wait a bit, can't he? Weren't we fast enough? Larry didn't understand the captain's impatience. Angel and Masuka's expressions darkened instantly. Well, Dexter told us he'd be treating us to dinner tonight. Like a pack of lone dogs, Masuka, Angel, and Max lit up at the thought of not having to pay for another meal. That sounds great. Hours of hard work later, the sun had set. The beach near the bay was filled with barbecue stands, selling grilled seafood, barbecue skewers, and ice-cold beer. There was no doubt that business was booming. As night fell, more and more people arrived at the beach. This time, a trio of men sat around a round table, enjoying grilled seafood and cold beer. Oysters, with half of their shells cracked open, were placed on the grill. As the fire roasted them, they shrank and bubbled slightly. Larry picked up an oyster, used a knife to gently peel away the adductor muscle attached to the smooth inner surface, dipped it in a bit of seafood sauce, and popped it into his mouth. This reminds me of... Don't mention it, or we'll get kicked out of this place. Damn it, we agreed not to talk about work outside the department. Masuka interrupted Larry before he could say anything strange. Now that I think about it, we're all forensic specialists at this table, Dexter said, looking at Masuka, who was already quite drunk. Well, it's a shame Angel's daughter got sick. I hope the girl gets better. Masuka felt so bad about it that he downed the rest of his beer. Yeah, I hope she gets better, Larry said, his eyes fixed on the waves of the sea. What are you looking at? I'm just picturing jellyfish. Masuka looked at Larry, then at the ocean, and said, well, when I look at the sea, I imagine big-breasted mermaids. Damn, every illustration of a mermaid looks like something out of an adult magazine. Haha, keep your voice down, Dexter said, feeling the stares of the people around them. Larry, on the other hand, murmured, I like jellyfish. Regretting his own initiative, Dexter started thinking of a quick way to end what had become an increasingly out-of-control work dinner. January 2, 2006, 6:30 a.m. at Oleta River State Park, west of the city, near Miami-Dade County, Florida, a slender leg appeared in the grass near a spot where runners pass daily. At first glance, it showed a knife-wound, dense purple-black bloodstains, white bones, and pale skin, creating a shocking visual impact for whoever stumbled upon the body. Judging by the shape of the legs, the deceased was a young woman. Establish a larger perimeter. I want a record of the nearest cameras in this area, and under no circumstances do I want the press here. Larry, who had arrived first this time, walked forward without stopping, carrying the investigation kit. Max, the alternate forensic examiner, followed closely behind. Sergeant Dokes, walking behind them, stumbled and took a few steps forward. He steadied himself, looked up, saw the scene before him, and let out a startled exclamation. Holy hell, that's disgusting. When they reached the cordon, Lieutenant LaGuerta, who was in charge of the criminal investigation, approached. She greeted them, her flesh-colored latex gloves stained with shocking amounts of blood. Did you touch the crime scene? Larry's expression showed displeasure. Why were they treating him more like a criminal profiler than a forensic examiner? It's good to see you too, Forensic Examiner Luke. You got here quite fast. LaGuerta didn't take Larry's comment as offensive. She knew exactly what information she needed to collect to help him do his job as accurately as possible. Larry didn't make a big deal of it and asked, Hello, Lieutenant. Can you tell me about the situation here? Ask Masuka to give you the details. They were the first ones to make contact with the crime scene. Sergeant Dokes, with his burly frame, nodded and called out to Masuka, who approached with a notebook containing all the data. The people who called the police were Mr. Smith and his wife, who were out for their usual morning walk. It rained all day yesterday and didn't stop until 4, so they didn't go out at their usual time. Exact time? Larry asked in a serious tone, his right hand reaching into the pocket of his jacket to pull out a pocket watch. Yes, they arrived at the area just before 5:30 this morning. After walking for over 10 minutes, they entered this trail, which is the most popular route for many runners. Masuka adjusted his glasses and continued, as the Smiths were jogging, they noticed a leg sticking out from the grass. Taking a few steps closer, they realized it was a corpse, dismembered beyond recognition and partially devoured by a pack of wild dogs. The couple was so terrified that they turned around, ran back to where they had parked their vehicle, and then called the police. I was early at the station, so since I was on duty, I arrived immediately with the other forensic examiners who followed on the way, Masuka added, now considering Larry a friend. Tell me more about the scene. Larry filtered out any unnecessary details. Yes, after a preliminary analysis, I reported to the captain, and he told the command center to send for the famous criminal profiler because this case is unusual. That's why we only focused on identifying traces around the area. The victim, however, was never touched. Masuka made it clear that this case was both shocking and uncommon. For a criminal profiler, finding a crime scene untouched was the best-case scenario for discovering details others might overlook. Was it really that bad? Sergeant Dokes asked, observing some blood traces around the area. When we arrived, there were still a dozen wild dogs sniffing around. The scene was horrific, Masuka admitted, still feeling chills from the memory of the dogs growling. Follow the procedure, Max. At that moment, the young Max had put on his investigative suit and approached, holding a briefcase. Larry could only wait for Max to start taking photographs before beginning his examination of the body and the scene. Sergeant Dokes and the others also started changing into their protective gear. Have you determined the origin of the body? Larry asked while taking some unknown pills. Lieutenant LaGuardia sighed. We have no idea where the body came from, which is why I asked the command center to contact you directly. There are no missing person reports at the moment. And as you'll soon see, the victim is unrecognizable. To be more precise, she no longer has a face. Larry furrowed his brows. It seemed this would be a tough challenge for him as he began his work as a criminal profiler. Adrenaline surged through his body instantly, and all his investigative instincts kicked into high gear. In less than 15 minutes, Max returned. Larry rubbed his fingers, covered in 2 layers of rubber gloves. So soon. Max didn't have his usual playful expression. He looked both sad and angry and nodded seriously. Since it rained yesterday, the ground is sandy. The traces around here are extremely difficult to identify, completely overlapped with one another. Honestly, I have no idea if any of the photos I took mean anything. As Masuka said, there were so many wild dogs that the entire surface of the terrain is completely destroyed, Sergeant Dokes added after conducting his own inspection. We only managed to collect a few partial footprints, which were documented and photographed by Masuka's team. Now that they're done, we have the green light to begin. Anything. Larry had trained Max enough to know what he always looked for at a crime scene. I'll start searching the victim's clothing, though the wild dogs likely tore it apart. I wonder if I'll be able to find all of it. Maybe I can find something that identifies the victim. That's probably something Masuka's team already did. You should focus on what they wouldn't have considered, Larry thought, a bit disappointed in Max's intended course of action for the case. Well, let's hope it helps. Once you see it, you'll understand how tragic this crime really is. Angel, who had just arrived, listened quietly to everything being said. Numbers are important. Larry murmured as he let the pale-faced Max take a break. Only by witnessing the tragedy of the deceased with their own eyes can forensic pathologists deepen their sense of urgency and mission to find evidence. If you can't handle it, don't force yourself. The empathy you're feeling is clouding your judgment, and that makes you useless to me. Wait for me here. Don't worry, no one will laugh at you. Larry understood what Max was going through, but that kind of attitude was worthless in their line of work. Max shook his head and replied with a firm gaze, "Thank you for your concern, Larry, but I want to see what you'll do." First, Max would search for something, and then Larry would begin. This was the best way for him to teach Max the things he had overlooked in his previous observation. His empathy, this time, had proven that Max still had a long way to go. Larry nodded at Max, "All right, follow my lead." In fact, Max wasn't the only one eager to learn from him. All the detectives believed that working alongside someone like Larry would significantly improve their skills. "I see." Larry murmured as he put on a mask to block the smell. The closer you get to the crime scene, the stronger the scent of blood becomes. As he approached, Larry reached up and adjusted his mask even tighter, as if that simple action would allow him to breathe more easily. Forensic doctors were still human, and their reactions were normal. This action was also a psychological suggestion. Forensic specialists needed to regulate their mental state. Otherwise, being exposed to murder scenes every day would have driven him insane. But since Larry was already insane, what he did was merely a way to keep himself in control during investigations. Dressed in a white full-body investigation suit and blue shoe covers, Larry stepped onto the soft sand, producing a faint crunching sound. Many detectives turned to look at them as they walked 30 meters around the perimeter, surrounding the bushes. Within seconds, the full silhouette of the female corpse was exposed before Larry. Even he, accustomed to witnessing life and death with his own eyes, couldn't help but hold his breath. The young teenage girl's body lay on its side on the ground, her head tilted toward the grass. Her long, tangled, and dull hair spread around her skull. Her face was completely disfigured, without a nose or eyes, reduced to an unrecognizable mass of mutilated flesh, making it impossible to discern what she had looked like in life. The victim's body bore multiple cuts and lacerations, though none appeared to have been inflicted by a sharp weapon. The left hemisphere of her skull was completely missing, leaving only the right half of the cranial sphere intact. It was impossible to determine whether the missing portion had been precisely severed or devoured by wild dogs. The corpse lay with both hands raised above her head, deep binding marks visible on her wrists. Just below her hands, a sky-blue knot hung loosely. The most chilling detail was the shape of the knot, a perfectly tied noose, as if someone had arranged it with intention. The victim's hands were destroyed from her desperate struggle. The skin had been torn to the extreme, and on her right hand, only fragile scraps of flesh kept her ring, middle, and index fingers attached, faint remnants of a futile attempt to free herself. Her palms displayed abrasions, and all the wounds on her face and limbs showed signs of being inflicted while she was still alive. She had a deep wound in her abdomen, from which her internal organs had been removed, leaving her body incomplete and mutilated. In contrast, the injuries on her legs were fewer, but no less cruel. Aside from a scrape on her knee, only 4 wounds were identified on her legs. However, each one was horrifyingly deep, with cuts slicing through her knees, popliteal fossa, and ankles, suggesting that her attacker had sought to prevent any chance of escape. Or perhaps unleash their fury in the most ruthless way possible. Max vomited several times behind Larry before immediately fleeing. He couldn't take it anymore. The intense, overwhelming smell of blood had instantly churned his stomach. Meanwhile, Larry crouched beside the corpse and examined it closely. The edges of the wounds on the face, chest, and abdomen bore numerous bite marks. This was definitely the work of those wild dogs, Larry murmured to himself, his expression completely devoid of disgust. The wild dogs had wreaked havoc on the body, making the autopsy significantly more complicated. Larry began silently counting. The wounds were countless, but at a glance, he could identify at least 100. Half of them were so deep that they exposed the bone, a grotesque testament to the suffering the victim had endured. At that moment, Angel approached with a camera in hand. Taking over Max's role, he started photographing the body, helping Larry document every macabre detail. After capturing various fixed angles, Larry gently moved the victim's left leg. He wanted to adjust the body from a lateral position to a horizontal one in order to photograph the facial injuries more clearly. As he turned the corpse, Larry suddenly discovered a black knife handle wedged between the victim's legs. Angel, peering over his camera, gasped and sat back on the observation panel. "My God, this killer is a damn bastard." Larry felt the anger and tension building in his head, making his pulse race. There was nothing to study here. This crime was pure, unchecked brutality, nothing that a smart person would do. A murderer this ruthless couldn't be left free for long. "It looks like you need help, brother." Masuka approached, followed by Dexter, to analyze the crime scene. "Ask us for anything. We'll help you." Larry looked at Dexter, who said, "I have everything I need to analyze the blood." "Then photograph and secure the murder weapon," Larry ordered firmly. Then he added, "Bring me the evidence bag. Let's see if we can get viable fingerprints." "Don't worry, we'll find this bastard." Angel quickly handed him an evidence bag. Larry carefully grasped the upper and lower edges of the knife handle guard and, with a firm pull, removed it. Only then did he realize the impressive length of the blade, more than 20 centimeters of lethal edge. We're done. Find someone to transport the body back to the center. There's no point in saying anything more now. Finding out where the body came from is the top priority. Larry knew that staying in this place any longer wouldn't help, so he turned to Max, who was recovering, and asked, "By the way, what did you find when you were looking for clothing?" Max, having collected himself, said, "Masuka and his team found the clothes, but there's no valid identification that could help us." Larry's brows furrowed deeper. Although his expression remained indifferent on the outside, he knew the complexity of this case was growing more and more. After a moment of thought, Larry suddenly widened his eyes as if he'd had an epiphany and grabbed Max's hand. "Come on, show me the clothes." Max immediately knew that Larry must have thought of something, so he quickly handed him a box containing several evidence bags. Larry carefully peeled off a layer of latex gloves from his right hand, opened the evidence bag, and spread out the clothing to examine it closely. He observed that, although each piece was in a deplorable state, most remained dry, except for the areas speckled with sand. Among the garments, there was a pair of women's underwear and a bra adorned with white lace, along with a loose-fitting white shirt, blue jeans, and a pair of sneakers. The pants were relatively intact, displaying tears that matched those on the body, except for some obvious bite marks. Likewise, the damaged sections of the shirt bore traces of cuts made with a sharp blade, stained with blood. Most of the underwear and bra were soaked in blood, further worsening the damage caused by the bite wounds. Everything indicated that the victim came from a wealthy family and that the murderer had deliberately stripped her body of clothing. Larry's face suddenly showed understanding. He stood up and, with determined steps, walked toward Lieutenant LaGuerta. Angel followed him and made a phone call, arranging for a vehicle to transport the body to the identification center. Seeing Larry and Angel approach, LaGuerta hurried over, looking at Larry with hope. In complex cases like this, the skills of a criminal profiler were more than essential to making progress in the investigation. This criminal profiler, despite all his flaws, had proven to have extraordinary abilities. The last murder case had been solved in 48 hours thanks to Larry, which had shocked the homicide division. Everyone recognized his skill, which was why she had specifically ordered him to be here today. Forensic Dr. Luke. Give me some good news. This whole thing is a scandalous disaster. Lieutenant LaGuerta turned around and walked with Larry back to where the vehicles were parked. Larry took a deep breath and tried to calm his deductive thoughts. Only then could he view the problem more objectively. Even I can't work miracles in situations like this, Lieutenant. Just tell me what you have. Then. Larry stopped in his tracks, catching in the corner of his eye how Angel and Sergeant Dokes were preparing to take notes, and said, "This is the primary crime scene, so I conducted a preliminary examination of the body. Based on the initial evidence, I suspected that the motive for the crime could be revenge. From what I know, the victim is a woman approximately 162 centimeters tall, with an estimated weight between 45 and 50 kilograms. In my brief examination, I noticed the eruption of a third molar, suggesting her age to be around 16 or 17 years old. The body had mild staining with no signs of lethal wounds, suggesting that the cause of death was hemorrhagic shock. The victim was wearing a white shirt and a pair of Lee brand jeans instead of a school uniform. That's why the idea that she was abducted on her way to school is ruled out in our investigation. Her attire suggests she was out of the house, and her shoes. A summer model of Nike released this year reinforced the idea that she came from a well-off family." Larry paused, removed his mask from his face after taking off his gloves, and said, "Furthermore, last night was Sunday, and this type of clothing suggests the young woman was on her way home. If she was a high school student living in a boarding school, she should have returned to school that night to study on her own." The investigation could start by exploring this timeline and its possible connection to her school environment. Additionally, the victim had strangulation marks on her wrists and severe defensive wounds on both hands, indicating she fought against her attacker. The nature of the injury suggests that the killer had similar physical strength to the victim, without an overwhelming advantage. Although the internal organs and some wounds were consumed by wild dogs, the remaining injuries showed signs of being inflicted while she was still alive. All the wounds consisted of cuts and lacerations, with no deep injuries caused by a lethal blade. In my prior examination, I found no significant damage to the main organs, reaffirming that the cause of death was hemorrhagic shock. As for the murder weapon, it is a knife with a handguard, a type of regulated blade similar to a Mongolian knife. However, no registered mark was found on the knife's accessory, though the blade showed clear signs of burning and hammering. This suggests the weapon was modified or even handmade. The victim's perineal area had a stab wound with an abnormal reaction. However, the incision did not affect the vulva, the hymenal membrane was intact, and no signs of sexual assault were found. This detail reinforces the hypothesis that the killer might be a woman, although there is also the possibility that it was a young male underage. Rigor mortis was present throughout the body, but the stiffness in the leg joints was noticeably low. Although wild dogs had torn apart part of the clothing, it was dry, which, along with the rectal temperature and the state of rigor mortis, allowed us to determine that the victim was murdered between 5 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. the previous day. Angel widened his eyes and stared at Larry, who was holding the evidence bag containing the victim's clothes along with the murder weapon, causing the hairs on his skin to stand on end. Are you saying the deceased was a high school girl? LaGuerta could have sworn that the victim was at least of legal age. Larry nodded and said in a calm tone, "MMM. The victim must have been a pretty high school girl. Based on my initial assessment, the killer is a young girl of the same age as the victim or, alternatively, a male under 16. After handing the evidence bag to Max, who had just arrived, Larry removed his one-piece investigation suit. His clothes were already soaked in sweat by then. He took Angel's camera and showed the photos to Lieutenant LaGuerta, who remained silent, still processing everything she had just heard. You can see that the victim had restraint injuries and defensive wounds. But there were no stab wounds to vital organs. All the injuries were cuts and lacerations, and preliminary statistics indicate she suffered up to 100 wounds. This confirms my hypothesis: the killer harbored deep hatred toward the victim and committed an extremely brutal murder. A simple conflict could not have escalated into such cruelty. The wounds on the face and the stab wounds in the perineal area reinforce my belief that this was a revenge crime motivated by love. First, we need to investigate the nearby schools to check if any students are missing. Larry paused briefly and continued, "Only when we determine the victim's identity can we move on to the next stage of the investigation." Lieutenant LaGuerta patted Larry on the shoulder, looked at Sergeant Dokes, who stood beside her and no longer had a concerned expression, and suddenly felt a bit more confident that a criminal profiler would be the key to solving this case. "You surprise me, Larry. You usually seem very quiet. I didn't expect such a thorough case analysis. Now, let's retrieve the body and investigate the origin of the murder weapon," Sergeant Dokes said with evident hostility. Larry curled the corners of his lips slightly but still said, "All right. We're also leaving to prepare for the autopsy and we'll send you the results as soon as they're available." Several people filled the investigation box and evidence bags, and Larry led them back to the evaluation center. It took them 40 minutes to arrive. Larry and the other two quickly entered the center. Angel, who initially seemed relaxed, started to feel nervous. He followed Larry's steps and wondered if it was a good idea to accompany a criminal profiler in his investigation. Back in the autopsy room, Larry had already put on the isolation suit and looked at Angel, who seemed uneasy. "How's Max? If he hasn't recovered yet, can you ask Masuka to perform the autopsy with me?" Larry didn't have time to waste with a pathology student, especially when all he had was theoretical knowledge. Angel, who was in the same room as Larry, looked at Max, and when he saw the young man's pale face, he quickly advised, "I think it's best if Max sits this one out. It seems this case affected him more than the previous one. I'll only allow him 3 failures. Today will be his first mistake. By the 3rd, I'll remove him from the pathology division." "Sorry, boss. No, you're my student. You begged me to let you learn from me, but now all I see is a scared child." Max looked embarrassed. Larry put on an isolation suit and 2 layers of gloves, nodding slightly. "But don't worry, I don't blame you. After all, you just arrived, and what you see in school is completely different from real-life situations. Besides, the victim's state was too gruesome, and even for a forensic doctor, it's hard to process. Max immediately lifted his head and looked at the thin man who was half a head taller than him. Although Larry usually seemed serious and indifferent, when it came to mentoring, he still took good care of his intern. "Thank you, Professor." Larry gestured with his hand and said, "Fill out the necessary forms and then head to the monitoring room to privately study what we'll be doing here. The video has less sensory impact, and you can still learn something that way." Max opened the door and stepped out. At the same time, Masuka, who looked quite aggravated, was pushed forward by Angel. As the head of the pathology division, Masuka had made it clear that he wouldn't work on the cases Larry studied to avoid conflicts of opinion. It was well known that Larry despised forensic experts who overlooked small details, which had caused some dissatisfaction in the pathology division. "Angel, you've seen Larry's skills in performing autopsies. He only wants me as an extra pair of hands to cut a few bones. Anyone else could do what he's asking me to do, and besides, I have a backlog of work. But you're my friend, and besides, Dexter is analyzing the blood now." Larry greeted Masuka, who, after entering the room, regained his composure. "That changes things quite a bit," Masuka said, now slightly more convinced. "Masuka, this victim is too special, and you know it because you looked into it before she even arrived." "Yeah, but LaGuerta told me you'd handle it." "Looks like your skills have everyone in the homicide division captivated," Masuka said, slightly annoyed as he recalled the situation. "That doesn't matter. I'd like your help. My student can't assist me, and I need an extra pair of hands." Masuka stepped closer, leaned forward, and observed the deceased lying on the stainless steel dissection table. Instantly, he gagged and coughed twice. "Ahem. I don't think I remembered her being in this state. Looks like things changed after moving the body. Well, the smell is strong." "Yeah, but nothing I haven't seen before." Masuka quickly put on his gear and stepped forward. "All right, Max, get out." Only Angel, Masuka, and Larry remained in the room to perform the autopsy. The three of them silently offered a brief prayer for the victim. Though it was a ritual, it was also the final tribute to the deceased. If they wanted to uncover the truth, they had to let the body speak. Every forensic expert and their team must act as the voice of the dead, revealing the truth on their behalf. That was why Larry was so frustrated with the details that careless forensic experts overlooked and why he had chosen this career instead of becoming a detective. The clock in the autopsy room read 8:20. Larry, as the lead forensic examiner in this session, lifted his scalpel. "I'll follow your lead." As soon as Masuka started working, he left behind his friendly personality and focused entirely on the task. As the chief forensic examiner in the homicide division, he had to show Larry his skills. But Larry was in control. As soon as he immersed himself in the procedure, he disregarded emotions or actions that could disturb his concentration. With a precise cut, he opened the victim's throat and carefully examined the hyoid bone, thyroid cartilage, esophagus, and trachea. Then, he turned his attention to the lungs. There were no signs of drowning or lethal injuries in that area. A relevant detail, but not a conclusive one. He proceeded to open the stomach and found only traces of chyme. It was almost as if the victim hadn't eaten in hours. The remaining small intestine was practically empty. As the scalpel in his hand paused for a moment, Larry felt a chill run down his spine. Could I have miscalculated the time of death? Why is there no food in the stomach or intestines? The absence of digestive contents was an anomaly. If the victim had died recently, there should have been remnants of her last meal. But if too much time had passed since her last intake, that indicated another scenario: forced starvation, prior intoxication, or even that the body had been moved after death. Larry frowned. Each answer only led to more questions. Larry's actions caught Masuka's attention, who wasn't entirely familiar with his methods. "Why aren't you moving? The deceased's gastrointestinal tract is completely empty. This completely contradicts the livor mortis and rigor mortis." Larry pressed his lips together, analyzing the discrepancy. If the body showed clear signs of stiffness and post-mortem blood pooling, the digestive system shouldn't be so clean. Something didn't add up. "Masuka, on the other hand, didn't seem particularly concerned. He rolled his eyes dramatically and, staring at Larry, asked, "Dr. Larry, do you not have a girlfriend?" Larry frowned, puzzled. The question had come out of nowhere, completely unrelated to the autopsy. How had Masuka jumped to that? Masuka cleared his throat and smirked with an air of superiority. No matter how old women are, there's always one topic that's in fashion: weight loss. Larry blinked. Was he suggesting that the victim had been fasting intentionally? Suddenly, the theory started taking shape in his mind. The foundation of beauty, for many, is fairness and thinness, Masuka said, crossing his arms thoughtfully. Angel, who was standing behind them, added, "My wife is 2 years older than me, but she's strict with her routine: yoga every morning, no food afternoon, only meal replacement shakes." Some women take beauty discipline very seriously. There's your answer. Masuka gestured slightly toward the body. This girl, she had the same level of obsession, don't you think? Larry nodded slowly, but his expression remained tense. I understand, but something still doesn't add up. The deceased was between 16 and 17 years old. After saying that, Larry leaned over the body, examining the slender circumference of her legs. She must have weighed around 40 to 50 kilos and wasn't very tall. Why would someone her age subject themselves to such extreme weight loss? A heavy silence fell over the autopsy room. The question had no simple answer. There are many possibilities. Women take care of themselves to feel good. But I think this girl was in love. You think so? Yes, of course. My first time was at 16. No, you probably didn't even know about sex until you were 21. I was a beast back then, my golden years, Angel said, not wanting to brag but feeling compelled to mention a bit of his past life. If you're going to keep talking about trivialities in this place, you'd better leave, said Larry, slightly annoyed. Angel lowered his head to avoid drawing attention to himself. Then let's continue. Larry didn't bother addressing the nickname and raised his hand to resume the dissection. They proceeded to examine the remaining vital organs but found no fatal injuries. Everything seemed intact, only deepening the mystery surrounding the cause of death. A craniotomy was performed to inspect the brain tissue. However, the analysis did not reveal any significant abnormalities. The brain was in good condition, with no signs of hemorrhage, trauma, or visible disease. When Larry turned his attention to the victim's hips, he paused briefly. He decided not to take the pubic symphysis. The third molar had already confirmed the approximate age of the deceased, so an additional analysis of the pelvic bones was unnecessary. Furthermore, by preserving the skin on the chest and abdomen intact, the body would remain in a more dignified condition for later identification. With extreme precision, he carefully clipped the victim's nails for analysis and extracted a blood sample directly from the heart. Every small detail could hold the key to solving this enigma. Once they finished, they returned to examine the wounds on the deceased's face. Masuka, still fascinated, couldn't help but marvel at the peculiarity of the lacerations. The killer is right-handed and has precise control over each wound. Larry scanned the meticulous cuts on the victim's face. These were not impulsive or clumsy attacks, each incision showed a clear and calculated direction. The force used was minimal. Or perhaps the attacker deliberately prolonged the suffering. Masuka pointed out a disturbing detail: look at how many wounds overlap. These aren't random cuts, they form a pattern. More than 90% show signs of vitality. Larry took a moment to process this, feeling the weight of the cruelty reflected in the corpse. That means the victim was still alive when they were inflicted. This was pure torture. A heavy silence filled the morgue. They were not dealing with an ordinary murder. The crime scene was chosen intelligently, Larry said, mentally going over every detail. It wasn't a random choice but a carefully selected location to conceal the crime. This area is frequented by packs of wild dogs. The killer committed the crime at night, after the rain, ensuring that any trace would vanish with the mud and moisture. Masuka nodded silently, understanding the implication. If the dogs hadn't discovered the body this morning. Larry completed the sentence in a grave tone. By the next dawn, only a skeleton would have remained. After saying that, Larry added, perhaps that was part of the plan as well. A crime without a body is a crime without evidence. Angel, trying to avoid looking at what his colleagues were doing, nodded and said, when I went to look for traces around the area, I found at least a dozen wild dogs not far away, staring toward the forest's edge with a fierce look. The killer must have known for some time that wild dogs roamed this area. Calm, meticulous, resentful, and cruel. This killer is not ordinary. Larry narrowed his eyes, mentally reviewing every detail. Either they studied criminology or forensic medicine, or they were simply born with a criminal mind. Nothing about this murder was improvised. The silence in the morgue was almost suffocating. Masuka sighed and removed his gloves. Well, let's send the body to the freezer. The case had only just begun, but Larry already knew it wouldn't be easy to catch someone like this. It's past 1 o'clock. I'm starving, said Masuka, acting normally as he stepped away from the area where he had been working. Angel, speechless, looked at Larry, who had just received a call. Larry quickly removed his latex gloves and isolation gown. Hello, this is Larry. Forensic Dr. Luke, my name is Deborah Morgan, and I just found information about the origin of the body. We checked all the high schools near the crime scene, and after searching through the records of every female student who didn't attend class today, we found that one of them, Greta Meyer, couldn't be contacted. When we informed her parents about the incident, they said they thought she was at a friend's house. Larry didn't react with excitement. Instead, he asked, I assume you made sure the physical characteristics match, correct? Of course, her physical features matched the criteria provided by the Homicide Division. Deborah Morgan paused before continuing. According to my investigation, Greta's teacher, noticing her absence, contacted her parents. But now that we're involved, they are heading to the station. DNA tests are currently being processed to confirm whether she is the victim. Good work. Thanks for contacting me personally. Larry then hung up the call, and looking at his colleagues, he said, we may have found the origin of the body. That's good news. Her parents just arrived. Let's go meet them. That's not my job, Masuka said, uninterested in talking to the victims' families while working in the homicide department. Lucky you. Angel, I want you to record the entire conversation. I'll assess the parents myself. Larry knew this would reduce the chance of disputes. Understood, I'll assist you. As they exited the morgue, the desperate cries of two parents echoed through the hallway. They just wanted to see their daughter. To be precise, it was a howl. When humans are unable to express their pain, they often lose the ability to form words, and only the most primal cries and wails can escape. Larry had experienced this feeling before. He could understand what it was like to lose everything in a single day, so he quickly approached them. Good afternoon, I'm Larry Luke, forensic doctor and criminal profiler for the Homicide Division. Are you the parents of Greta Meyer? The father, who seemed to have the strongest willpower, nodded while crying. I ask you not to grieve just yet. Your blood has just been drawn to compare with the victims, as per procedure. For now, we cannot confirm that the deceased is your daughter. Angel, familiar with Larry's personality, felt a chill as he watched the men display a false empathy toward the victim's family. Please, have a seat. The woman, devastated, pleaded, Officer. Please, let me see my daughter. I can recognize her myself, I really can. Larry crouched so the woman, sitting on a sofa outside the waiting room, could look him in the eyes. Trying to soften his voice, he said, Ma'am, don't cry just yet. Sit here and wait for the comparison results. Maybe it's not time to worry yet. Mistakes were common, even more so in desperate situations like this. When trying to determine the identity of a minor victim, errors could be made very easily. Angel, on the other hand, was speaking with the men, who seemed to have stronger self-control. Let's go to the room to wait for the results. It's more comfortable to sit there, trust me. Follow me, we can talk about whatever you want while we wait. The two, confused, followed Larry to the break room like lifeless puppets. Once inside, Angel turned on a recorder and placed it on the table, along with 2 glasses of water and a pack of tissues. Larry, trying not to overwhelm them with questions, tactfully asked, "Do you have any photos of Greta Meyer?" Greta's father, Keller Meyer, pulled a small photo album from his jacket and handed it to Larry, who took it in silence. When Larry looked at the photograph of Miss Greta, she seemed to embody purity itself. Her face shone with a soft, ethereal light, and her large, bright eyes reflected an unblemished nobility, as if she had never known the weight of sin in this world. Looking at her, he could feel the beauty of life. She was a young girl in her prime, but just by seeing this photograph, Larry knew she was the victim. But thinking now about the state of the morgue freezer, Larry returned the photos to Keller, who had been evaluating his expression the entire time, as if trying to read the answer in his eyes. "Can you recall what kind of friends your daughter had? For example, high school friends, elementary school friends she's still in touch with, or classmates she frequently communicates with. Do you remember if they were boys or girls?" Larry tried not to reveal anything with his words. It wasn't his place to tell these parents their daughter was dead without scientific evidence. The question caught their attention, and little by little, they calmed down from their deep pain. They struggled to remember. Greta's mother thought for a moment and said in a trembling voice, "Greta is a very cheerful girl, she loves to laugh, so she has many friends. More than 20 friends have visited our house. Of them, I only remember a few names, and I know some of her close friends relatively well. Do you remember their names?" Angel pressed a little further. "Yes, one of them is Alejandro, he loves music, while the other boy is Nicholas. But the ones she spends the most time with are her friends, Valeria and Camila, though all 5 of them have been childhood friends. Also, the parents of our 5 families know each other quite well," Keller added. Given the situation, he didn't want to bring trouble to his daughter's friends. "That's true, last year, the 5 of us went to Disneyland together." "Interesting, it seems like the parents are very close." Keller nodded while holding back tears and said, "Basically, we all work in government offices. The residential area where we live isn't far apart, so over time, we got to know each other." Larry made small observations and quickly learned something. These 2 people were unaware that their daughter had a tendency to fall in love at an early age. At this point, he didn't think Greta Meyer was the kind of teenager who could harm someone else. "That will be enough for now. I will personally come back when the DNA test results are revealed," Larry said in a calm tone before looking away from the desperate couple. He was too busy. He still had to classify every piece of collected evidence to reconstruct a clear timeline, so he left Angel in charge of informing the victim's parents. 4 hours later, Larry's phone vibrated. It was a message from DEXTER. The DNA comparison results had arrived. The result was indisputable: the deceased was, without a doubt, the Meyers' daughter. However, the psychological distraction strategy Larry had applied earlier had worked. When the parents received the news, their reactions were much more contained than when they had first entered the forensic center. Larry showed them the test papers and spoke with the seriousness the moment demanded. "The results have been released. Unfortunately, the deceased is your daughter, Greta Meyer." Greta Meyer's mother covered her face with both hands and broke into sobs, her body shaking with broken cries. Beside her, her husband struggled to keep his jaw clenched, but the trembling in his cheeks betrayed him. "I want to see my daughter," Keller exclaimed desperately. Larry shook his head. He couldn't give in to compassion at that moment. Allowing them to see the body in that state would only worsen their trauma and hinder their emotional recovery. "I wouldn't recommend it." Larry wouldn't subject this poor couple to an image they would never be able to erase from their minds. Their lives would likely change forever, but at least he would leave them with a good memory of their daughter, not the girl currently lying in the morgue freezer. "Understand that if your daughter's identity could have been confirmed just by her appearance, we wouldn't have had to investigate all the high schools in the area where she was found." Larry let his words sink into the hearts of these desperate parents before continuing. "Now, please cooperate with the investigation. Catching the killer and ensuring they don't go unpunished. That will be the best justice for Greta Meyer, trust me." Keller's eyes were bloodshot, his face streaked with tears, but even so, he nodded vigorously. "We'll help in any way you need. Keep this in mind, I want the criminal to pay for their crimes just as much as you do." Greta Meyer's mother wiped her face with a tissue, trying to control her emotions, and grabbed Larry's hands with trembling fingers. "I understand why you won't let me see her, but if I can't, I'll never feel like she's truly gone from this world. But I suppose my poor baby must have been left in a terrible state. I will leave my fury in your hands. Please, catch the bastard who took my only daughter." Larry squeezed her hand firmly. "Yes, I promise both of you that I will catch them. They won't escape without paying in life for what they did to your daughter." Keller looked into Larry's eyes. Those cold eyes, filled with sinister intentions, gave him the certainty that the man before him was someone dedicated to his work, someone who wouldn't rest until he fulfilled his promises. "Come on, dear, we need to pray for our little Greta to rest in peace." "Yes. One last thing, although we shouldn't be asking this now, in order to catch the killer as soon as possible, we need to go to her house to look for clues. Do you think that's appropriate?" "You can search anywhere, you have my approval." Caller, Greta's father, had murder in his eyes. If he was holding back now, it was because of his wife, but a part of him wanted to take revenge with his own hands. Angel, standing behind Larry, said, "We need to hurry." Larry, of course, had no objections. When they went downstairs, they saw Sergeant Dokes and 4 other men standing in the hallway. Without exchanging pleasantries, they briefly introduced themselves and got ready to leave. At that moment, the glass door of the center was forcefully pushed open, producing a loud metallic noise. 2 young figures came running in, and Larry's pupils shrank. He looked at Angel, then at the police recorder in his hands, and then behind them. Angel immediately understood after seeing this reaction. He subtly turned, used his back to block the view, pulled out the police recorder, and slipped it into Max's chest pocket as he was preparing to assist Larry with the investigation. As foolish as Max could be, he understood what that meant. His phone vibrated, and sure enough, Larry had sent him a message. "Stay behind to observe her 2 students and take good notes. Also, remember to collect fingerprints, blood samples, and statements from everyone." The 2 students who had rushed in were stunned to see Mr. and Mrs. Meyer and ran toward them. The boy stared at Caller and asked in a trembling voice, "Is it really her?" The girl beside him asked in a more reserved tone, "It can't be, is it really Greta?" Greta's father nodded and forced a faint movement of his lips to feign strength. "Nicholas, Camila, why are you here instead of attending class?" Larry knew they were good friends of Greta and that they attended the same class. He had asked Max to receive them just to see if there was anything suspicious about them. After all, he could listen to the recording when he returned. Camila was already crying, thick tears streaming from her eyes. With her tall and slender figure, not even the school uniform could hide her beauty. It was incredible that 2 such beautiful girls were such close friends. "Martha, we just wanted to come and see if it was really Greta. When the police arrived, they started asking us questions." Camila explained how they had learned that the police were at the school due to Greta's disappearance. Greta's mother looked around and saw so many police officers waiting, so she didn't say anything else and asked, "How did you get here?" Nicholas pointed toward the door. "I asked my dad to send a driver to bring us here. Don't worry, we'll be back at school soon." Greta's mother stretched her head to see the car outside and nodded with reddened eyes. "Don't stay too long, go back to school soon." Larry remained silent the entire way. The deep wrinkles on Sergeant Dokes' forehead never eased from start to finish. "Since we had nothing, we could only start by investigating the victim's social connections, but this will inevitably affect the students in her class." After saying this, Sergeant Dokes murmured, "I spoke with her teacher before coming. The school is taking a very tough stance and is unwilling to cooperate. On top of that, high-ranking political figures are getting involved." In no time, the group of detectives, followed by Larry, arrived at the Meyer family home. The Meyer family lived in a grand mansion in an exclusive neighborhood, covering nearly 3,000 square meters. For this couple working in a government office, the price of such a house was obviously beyond their financial means. "We're looking for items most closely related to the victim. Remember not to touch anything with your hands before it has been examined in the lab. I don't want to contaminate any potential evidence," Larry said. He knew that criminals sometimes planted evidence in places where the victim had never been. In this case, items that could have been at the crime scene might now be in the Mayer home, so Larry didn't want to rule anything out in his intricate world of endless possibilities. Everyone began a thorough search of Greta Meyer's room on the second floor. But after searching for a long time, they only found Greta's laptop. Her cell phone and school backpack were missing. At that moment, Sergeant Dokes was speaking with the victim's parents, who had returned home to assist with the investigation. Determined to get to the bottom of everything, Larry asked the parents to bring him all of Greta's diaries so he could fully analyze her life like a criminal profiler. Larry removed his gloves and nodded slightly at Mr. and Mrs. Mayer, who had remained silent. In addition to the diaries, we will need to confiscate Greta Meyer's laptop for the investigation. Don't worry, everything will be returned intact. Shortly after, Greta's mother approached Larry, looked at him, and said, "I have prepared my daughter's clothes. Please, dress her." As everyone was leaving, Larry sat in the car without saying a word, while Sergeant Dokes sighed repeatedly. A girl that young, dying in such a cruel way, this world is getting worse and worse. Angel and the other detectives had just reviewed the surveillance cameras from the private area and discovered that Greta Mayer had left home in a taxi at 2 in the afternoon on the same day she was murdered. The taxi's license plate was not clearly visible in the image, so they sent the surveillance footage to the technical team for analysis. It's time. Let's regroup and head to the school tomorrow for the real investigation. But this time, we'll take a warrant. Those bastards will listen, Sergeant Dokes said. He had been treated like a nobody before, but this time, he would make sure those teachers cooperated. When Angel got into the van, he glanced at Larry, who was still silent. Normally, in moments like this, Angel respected Larry's opinions the most. After all, he was a criminal profiler and, as such, was leading the investigation. I want to be there when they interrogate the students. These kids are smart and can easily deceive average detectives, Larry said. Before coming to Miami, he had worked on a multiple murder case where an entire family was massacred. The perpetrator had been a child under 15 who had faked everything. That was why, if they were friends of the victim, anyone needed to be questioned. Also, Sergeant Dokes, could you check the income of the victim's parents? It seems a bit unlikely that 2 government employees could afford such a mansion. Angel had also noticed this peculiar detail and added, they have many luxuries, top-tier cars, and live in an enormous mansion. According to Greta's father, the 5 families of her friends are all close. Do you think there's some conflict between those families that we don't know about? I think I have an idea about this issue. I'll explain when we get to the station. The next day, Larry arrived at the school gates, followed by Angel, just as they had planned the day before. Sergeant Dokes, who was already at the school, greeted them from a distance. As they approached, Dokes said, I just got a call from the station. We now have the full report on the Mayers, and it's on its way. A few minutes later, a police patrol arrived with the information folders, and Larry, as the lead investigator, took one. Keller Mayer, Deputy Secretary of Urban Development and Deputy Director of the Miami Office of Planning and Zoning, had made relevant statements about the property, according to the available information. The primary source of his wealth came from compensations received for the demolition of old housing units. As for the victim's mother, Martha Mayer, a 43-year-old woman, as director of the Miami Department of Housing and Community Development, her work went beyond bureaucracy. She oversaw affordable housing projects, managed urban development funding, and regulated housing assistance programs. Although her position might seem low profile, her decisions directly influenced the city's expansion and transformation. When Larry read this almost perfect information, he frowned. From what he gathered, even though they worked in 2 different offices, they had many connections to each other. Larry handed the folder back to Sergeant Dokes beside him. This is information provided by the department. It would be more precise and detailed if we got more data from external sources. Sergeant Dokes ran a hand over his shaved head, looking frustrated. We don't have enough personnel. Another team is investigating the murder weapon, so I sent an investigator to their department to verify everything. Do you think the case is related to their parents' occupations? That was the only reason Dokes could think of for Larry's insistence on investigating the victim's parents. But Larry shook his head, still not explaining anything. Forget it. Let's go to the school first. I'm swimming in a sea of possibilities, so I doubt everyone until things are clear. The group made their way to the school security booth. Even with the warrant in hand, Sergeant Dokes had to call multiple times before they were allowed in. Nowadays, every successful family had at most one child, and they were all sent here. So the school was extremely cautious. After all, they didn't want more children to be affected. This is a prestigious high school, well known, which is why parents with certain means go to great lengths to send their children here. Any child selected for this school comes from a wealthy family. Moreover, as the end of the semester approaches, each student's grades are tied to the teacher's income, so some don't bother wasting time. However, this case had to be handled, leaving Principal Bob with no choice but to comply. Still, a request was made to minimize the impact on the students. If any inquiries were needed, they had to be completed today, and a teacher from the school had to be present. Sergeant Dokes immediately agreed and led his men quietly onto the campus. None of them wore police uniforms, but anyone with sharp eyes would notice the guns on their belts, especially Sergeant Dokes, who always carried his weapon in a shoulder holster. Following Principal Bob, they were all led to the teaching department on the second floor. The teaching department and 3 adjacent offices were temporarily requisitioned. After waiting for a while, the principal arrived, rushing in with a stack of textbooks under his arm. "All right, here's what you asked for, and this is Professor Wilson from Greta's class," Bob said before hastily leaving. "Sorry for the delay. I was discussing exam preparations in the classroom and didn't make it in time." Sergeant Dokes smiled and waved his hand. "Professor Dave, don't be so formal. We've delayed your class, so we're the ones who should apologize. However, since we all have tight schedules, please call Alejandro Hernandez, Nicholas McFly, Valeria Parker, and Camila Wells." Dave checked his watch and said, "Yes, we have time." Less than 5 minutes later, someone knocked on the door, and 2 students, a boy and a girl, walked in. They already knew these students, Nicholas and Camila, both well presented, but they hadn't expected Valeria and Alejandro to be similar. Alejandro was over 170 centimeters tall, with the popular long bangs that completely covered his eyebrows, and his narrow eyes were slightly downturned. As Alejandro entered the room, he greeted Professor Dave but said nothing and shoved his hands into his pockets. As for Valeria, the sweet-looking girl seemed kinder. Her large eyes held a shadow of fear, and she kept glancing at the silent detective since stepping through the door. With her hands behind her back, her toes kept rubbing against each other as she stood there. The pedals of her white leather shoes trembled with her movements. It was evident that she was nervous. But there was nothing wrong with that kind of tension. Normal people get nervous when they see detectives because beyond the badge, there's a strong sense of justice that carries an oppressive presence. Sergeant Dokes made some arrangements and asked the professor to take the other students to the adjacent classroom while they spoke with Alejandro in the teacher's presence. "We'll stay with him. You can interrogate the other students." Larry's words piqued everyone's interest. So, as he said, instead of wasting time, they all began preparing for the separate interrogations. "Come on, Alejandro, we just want to understand the situation a little better." But Alejandro still said nothing. He sat in a chair, staring at the table. Larry and Sergeant Dokes sat across from him. Sergeant Dokes opened the transcript and began the interrogation. "Do you know Greta Meyer?"
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.